Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a world of chrome-finned Cadillacs, backyard bomb shelters, and predictions so wildly optimistic they make your smartphone look like a betrayal. We're talking about what 1950s Americans thought life would look like in the year 2000. The space-age fantasies, the robot butlers, the flying cars they were absolutely certain would replace highways. It was a decade drunk on possibility, convinced that science would solve everything from rush hour traffic to burnt toast, and that the future would arrive looking like a World's Fair exhibit designed by someone who had never heard the word budget. Before we drift into this retrofuturistic daydream, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these strange little time capsules where history gets wonderfully weird. And a huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You always send me the best ideas, and honestly, your suggestions shape this whole channel, so drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I know someone out there is 3 cups of coffee deep at 2 in the morning, pretending this counts as productivity. The channel is now live on Spotify, so if you want to take these stories with you, the link is in the description. Check it out whenever it feels right. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft hum of white noise, wiggle down under your blanket and get comfortable, really comfortable. Like you're settling in for a long, gentle drift through someone else's imagination. Because tonight, we're exploring what people in the 50s believed the future would hold. A world where food came in pill form, where weather was controlled by machines, where cities floated and commutes happened via personal jetpack. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to live in an era so confident that tomorrow would be miraculous? What did they picture when they imagined the year 2000? Did they think we would still have problems, or did they assume technology would erase struggle entirely? What did a housewife in 1955 imagine her granddaughter's kitchen would look like? Did anyone predict that we would still be stuck in traffic, still doing laundry, still arguing about dinner? And just like that, it is 1955. The television is glowing softly in the living room. Someone down the street is mowing their lawn in geometric lines. And in living rooms across America, people are flipping through magazines filled with glossy illustrations of tomorrow, a tomorrow that looks nothing like the world we actually got, but everything like the world they desperately wanted to believe in. Let us start with a dream that refused to die: flying cars. In the 1950s, if you asked the average American what transportation would look like in the year 2000, they would not hesitate. Cars would fly, obviously. Highways would be relics, museums pieces gathering, dust beside covered wagons and penny farthings. The future they believed belonged to the sky. Magazine illustrations showed sleek vehicles gliding between skyscrapers, their chrome bodies reflecting sunlight, their drivers relaxed behind curved windshields, briefcases resting beside them, traffic jams a distant memory. The cars looked like something between a Cadillac and a spaceship, all smooth lines and confident curves, designed by people who believed aerodynamics and optimism were the same thing. Some had wings, others had rotors, a few simply hovered, suspended by forces the artist did not bother explaining because the future, everyone assumed, would handle the details. Children flipping through these magazines traced their fingers over the images, imagining themselves 30 years older, piloting their own flying car to work, to the grocery store, to Sunday dinner at their parents' house. It seemed inevitable. After all, airplanes had only existed for 50 years and already they crossed oceans. Surely by the year 2000, flight would be as common as driving. The logic felt airtight. Technology was accelerating. Cars were getting faster, sleeker, more powerful. Planes were getting safer, cheaper, more accessible. Put the two together and you got the flying car, a vehicle that combined the convenience of an automobile with the freedom of an aircraft. No more waiting at red lights, no more construction delays, just open sky, unlimited routes, and the gentle hum of engines carrying you wherever you needed to go. Scientists and engineers encouraged this thinking. They gave interviews promising that flying cars were not fantasy but inevitability, a matter of when, not if. Prototypes appeared at exhibitions, awkward contraptions that sputtered and wobbled but still managed to lift off the ground, and that was enough. The proof of concept existed. The rest was just refinement, just time, just patience. And if flying cars seemed too complicated, there was always the jetpack, personal jetpacks, strapped to your back like a knapsack controlled with simple levers, capable of lifting you hundreds of feet into the air. Commuters would rocket from their suburban homes to downtown offices, landing gently on rooftop pads, folding their jetpacks, and heading inside for coffee. It was beautiful. It was simple. It was absolutely going to happen. No one worried much about logistics, about air traffic control for millions of flying vehicles, about the noise of engines overhead at all hours, about what happened when someone's flying car malfunctioned above a crowded street. Those were problems for future engineers to solve, and future engineers, everyone believed, would be brilliant. The 1950s looked at the sky and saw possibility, endless, shimmering possibility. They saw a future where gravity was optional, where distance collapsed, where the morning commute became an adventure instead of a chore. They could not have known that the year 2000 would arrive with highways still packed, traffic still crawling, and the sky still reserved for planes and birds. But for a while, in those glossy magazine pages, in those optimistic conversations over dinner tables, the future flew, and it flew beautifully. The 1950s housewife standing at her kitchen sink with soapy hands and a back that ached from scrubbing had one very specific fantasy about the year 2000. She would not be doing any of this. Robots would. Sleek, obedient, tireless robots that vacuumed, dusted, cooked, and possibly offered witty commentary while folding laundry. She pictured a machine shaped vaguely like a person, though shinier, more polished, with a friendly face that never frowned, and joints that moved with smooth precision. It would glide through the house on quiet wheels, extending mechanical arms to lift dishes, to wipe counters, to arrange flowers in vases. It would know her schedule. It would anticipate her needs, would never complain about overtime. The fantasy was not lazy. It was hopeful. Household work consumed hours, real, exhausting hours. Washing clothes by hand, hanging them to dry, ironing every shirt and skirt and tablecloth, scrubbing floors on hands and knees, preparing meals from scratch, 3 times a day, every day, forever. The work was endless, invisible, and desperately undervalued. A robot butler was not about avoiding responsibility. It was about reclaiming time. Time to read. Time to create. Time to exist as something more than a walking appliance. Magazines agreed. They showed illustrations of robot servants carrying breakfast trays, sweeping living rooms, even tucking children into bed. The robots looked capable and kind, designed to help rather than replace, to ease burdens rather than eliminate purpose. They would handle the drudgery so humans could handle the meaning. Engineers promised it was coming. Automation was already transforming factories, replacing assembly line workers with mechanical arms that never tired, never made mistakes, never asked for raises. Extrapolating forward, it seemed obvious that the same technology would migrate into homes. Why should factories have all the robots? Why not bring that efficiency, that tirelessness into kitchens and laundries and nurseries? Some designs went further. Robot butlers that could hold conversations, that could learn your preferences, your moods, your habits, that could greet you at the door after a long day and ask in a voice calm and reassuring how they could help. It was companionship wrapped in circuitry, a helper who never judged, never gossiped, never grew resentful. Children imagined robots as friends. Adults imagined them as staff. Everyone imagined them as inevitable. The technology existed. Computers were getting smaller, faster, smarter. Mechanical engineering was advancing. Combine the two and you got the household robot, a machine intelligent enough to navigate a home, dexterous enough to handle fragile dishes, and patient enough to deal with the chaos of family life. No one stopped to consider the cost. Whether ordinary families could afford personal robots, whether the technology required to create a truly helpful android would remain prohibitively expensive for decades, whether people might resist inviting machines into the intimate spaces of their homes. Those concerns felt small compared to the dream, because the dream was beautiful. It was a future where technology served humanity, where machines took on the work that exhausted bodies and stole time, where homes became places of rest instead of endless labour. It was a future where the question was not what needs doing, but what do you want to do today? And for the housewife at her sink, hands deep in dishwater, that future could not arrive fast enough. Cooking in the 1950s took time, real time, the kind of time that involved peeling potatoes, kneading dough and waiting for casseroles to finish baking while the kitchen turned into a low-grade sauna. So when people imagined the year 2000, they pictured a future where food was efficient, compact, scientific. They pictured pills, a single pill for breakfast, another for lunch, a third for dinner, each one containing every vitamin, mineral, protein and calorie your body needed, compressed into something the size of an aspirin. No shopping, no chopping, no dishes, just clean, efficient nutrition delivered in seconds, leaving the rest of your day free for more important pursuits. The appeal was obvious. Cooking was labour, grocery shopping was labour, meal planning, food storage, clean-up, all labour. And for what? To fuel a body that would be hungry again in a few hours. The 1950s looked at this cycle and decided it was wasteful, inefficient, primitive. Surely science could do better. Illustrations showed families gathered around tables, each person swallowing their meal in pill form, smiling, as they saved hours previously lost to cooking. Some versions included flavour options, pills that tasted like steak, like apple pie, like Thanksgiving dinner, delivering not just nutrition but experience, memory, satisfaction, all without the effort. It was not just laziness driving this vision, it was optimism about what humanity could accomplish with reclaimed time. If meals took seconds instead of hours, people could work on art, on innovation, on connection. Freed from the kitchen, they could pursue dreams. The food pill was not about giving up something precious. It was about gaining something invaluable. Scientists encouraged the fantasy. Nutrition research was uncovering exactly which compounds the body needed to function. Vitamins were being isolated, synthesized, concentrated. If you could identify the essential elements of a meal, why not deliver them directly, efficiently, without the messy intermediary of actual food? It made logical sense, at least on paper, in the kind of thinking that values efficiency over experience. Some predictions went further. Meal machines that could produce any dish instantly. You would select your dinner from a menu, press a button, and moments later a fully cooked meal would emerge, hot and ready, assembled molecule by molecule. It was the food pill concept expanded, offering variety while maintaining speed. No recipes to follow, no ingredients to gather, just instant gratification in edible form. No one stopped to consider whether people would actually want this, whether the ritual of cooking, of eating together, of tasting and savouring and sharing mattered more than efficiency, whether food was about more than fuel, whether meals were about more than nutrients. Those questions felt sentimental in the face of progress. Because progress meant optimization. It meant eliminating waste, streamlining processes, making everything faster and cleaner and simpler. Food pills represented the ultimate optimization, the final evolution of eating, the point where necessity met technology and produced something almost magical. Children heard about food pills and thought they sounded like candy. Adults heard about them and thought they sounded like freedom. And for a brief moment in the 1950s, before anyone had actually tried one, before anyone realized that eating is about more than survival, the future of food looked like a handful of capsules and the promise of never doing dishes again. It was a strange dream, but it was sincerely believed. The 1950s looked at crowded city streets, at traffic jams and smog, and the slow crush of urban sprawl, and decided the solution was obvious. Build somewhere else, not outward, not wider, up or down. Cities would float in the clouds or rest beneath the ocean, gleaming and futuristic, places where the problems of the present simply could not follow. Sky cities appeared in illustrations like castles made of glass and steel, suspended thousands of feet above the earth by anti-gravity technology that artists drew but engineers had not quite invented yet. Platforms held neighborhoods, shopping districts, parks with trees somehow thriving in open air. Transparent tubes connected buildings, carrying people on moving walkways between home and work, school and recreation, everything accessible, everything connected, all of it floating serenely above the mess below. The vision was breathtaking, literally. Up there, the air would be clean, pure, untouched by factory smoke or car exhaust. Residents would wake to sunrises unobstructed by buildings, would watch clouds drift past their windows, would live in perpetual light and space and freedom. Gravity would be managed, weather would be controlled, and the cities below, the old struggling overcrowded cities, could be abandoned or repurposed, left to history while humanity ascended. But if the sky felt too uncertain, too dependent on technology that might never arrive, there was always the ocean, underwater cities, domed metropolises resting on the seafloor, surrounded by coral reefs and schools of fish, entire communities living in pressurized bubbles, looking up at the surface the way others looked up at stars. The illustration showed this too. Transparent domes enclosing neighborhoods, artificial light mimicking sunlight, submarines gliding between buildings like cars on streets. People would walk through tunnels watching whales pass overhead. Children would grow up knowing the ocean not as something distant but as their backyard, their playground, their constant view. Scientists would have unlimited access to marine life. Resources from the ocean floor would fuel economies, and above, on land, overcrowding would ease. Engineers took this seriously. Plans were drawn, prototypes discussed. The ocean, after all, covered most of the planet. Why limit humanity to the narrow strip of habitable land when so much space existed beneath the waves? Technology was advancing. Submarines dove deeper every year. Materials science was creating stronger, lighter structures. Put it all together, and underwater cities stopped being fantasy and started feeling like engineering challenges, difficult but solvable. The 1950s believed in expansion, in going where no one had gone before, in solving problems not by reducing demand but by increasing supply. Too many people, build more cities, running out of room, find new room. The planet was vast, and most of it, the sky, the ocean, remained untouched, waiting for the ambition to claim it. No one worried much about practicality, about the cost of building cities that defied gravity or withstood ocean pressure, about supplying food and water to populations living miles above or below the surface, about what happened if something went wrong, if a dome cracked or a platform failed. Those were details. The vision was what mattered, because the vision was magnificent. It was humanity unbound from geography, free to live anywhere, everywhere, in environments designed for comfort and beauty rather than accident of birthplace. It was the ultimate expression of human ingenuity, the idea that we could build our way out of any problem, that technology would always provide another option. And so they dreamed of sky cities and ocean domes, of populations scattered across altitudes and depths, of a future where Earth was not a single surface, but a layered habitat, explored and occupied at every level. It was ambitious, it was hopeful, and it was absolutely certain. Rain ruined picnics, snow snarled traffic, heat waves made people irritable, hurricanes destroyed homes. In the 1950s, weather was an inconvenience, an unpredictable force that disrupted plans and refused to cooperate. But in the year 2000, weather would be controlled, managed, scheduled like a dentist appointment. The fantasy was simple, a world where meteorologists did not just predict weather but commanded it. Rain would fall on farmland when crops needed watering, then stop. Snow would blanket ski resorts on schedule, then melt. Sunshine would arrive for outdoor weddings, holidays, harvest festivals, dependable as clockwork. Hurricanes would be dissolved before forming, tornadoes redirected, droughts ended with the flip of a switch. Illustrations showed control rooms filled with dials and screens, technicians in white coats monitoring atmospheric conditions, adjusting pressures, steering fronts, sculpting weather patterns like artists shaping clay. It looked scientific, official, inevitable. If humans could split atoms and fly to the moon, surely they could manage something as simple as clouds. The logic felt sound. Weather was just physics. Air pressure, temperature, moisture, wind. Understand the variables, control the inputs, and you controlled the outcome. Scientists were already seeding clouds to encourage rain, already studying jet streams and ocean currents. Extrapolate forward, and you reached a future where weather was no longer chance but choice, no longer chaos but calendar. Farmers loved the idea. Imagine never losing a crop to unexpected frost, to drought, to storms that arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Imagine planting with confidence, knowing rain would come when needed, sunshine when required, perfect growing conditions guaranteed. Food production would soar, hunger would diminish, agriculture would transform from gamble to certainty. Cities loved it too. No more blizzards shutting down transportation, no more heat waves overwhelming power grids, no more flooding, no more ice storms, no more weather-related disasters. Infrastructure could be designed for predictable conditions. Emergency services could focus on other crises. Life would smooth out, steady and reliable, freed from nature's tantrums. Even recreation would benefit. Ski resorts could guarantee snow. Beach towns could promise sun. Outdoor events would never face cancellation. Theme parks, concerts, weddings, all scheduled without backup plans, without anxiety, without crossing fingers and hoping the forecast held. The technology seemed within reach. Cloud seeding worked, at least sometimes. Scientists understood weather patterns better every year. Computers were getting powerful enough to model atmospheric systems. Add time, funding, ambition, and weather control stopped being science fiction and started feeling like the next logical step. No one considered unintended consequences. What happened if different regions wanted conflicting weather? If farmers needed rain while cities wanted sun? Who decided where storms went, if they went anywhere at all? What happened to ecosystems adapted to natural weather cycles? Those questions felt small compared to the dream of mastery. Because mastery was the goal, not just prediction, not just adaptation, but control. Complete, confident control over forces that had shaped human civilization since the beginning. It was the ultimate expression of technological optimism, the belief that nature was not destiny but material, something to be shaped and directed according to human will. The 1950s looked at stormy skies and saw not chaos but potential. They saw a future where weather served humanity instead of challenging it, where the forecast was not a guess but a plan, where stepping outside meant knowing exactly what to expect. It was a beautiful vision, orderly, safe, perfectly scheduled. And like so many dreams from that era, it underestimated the complexity of systems humans did not fully understand, and overestimated the wisdom of those who would control them. But still, the dream persisted. The dream of sunny days on demand. And somewhere, in living rooms across America, people looked at rain-soaked windows and imagined a future where weather finally learned to cooperate. Walking, the 1950s decided, was inefficient. Sure, it was free, relatively healthy, and required no special equipment. But it was slow, and the future, as everyone knew, would not tolerate slowness. So they imagined a world where sidewalks moved, where entire city blocks glided forward on massive conveyor belts, carrying pedestrians from home to work to the grocery store without a single step required. The concept appeared everywhere. Magazine covers showed smiling commuters standing casually on moving platforms, briefcases in hand, newspapers tucked under arms, gliding past storefronts at a steady clip. Some illustrations featured multiple lanes, each moving at different speeds, slow lanes for browsing, fast lanes for those in a hurry, express lanes for cross-city travel. You would step on, stand still, and arrive. Simple, effortless, modern. It was not entirely fantasy. Moving sidewalks already existed in airports, in train stations, short stretches of rubber belt designed to help travellers cover long distances without exhaustion. The 1950s looked at these and thought, why stop there? Why limit the technology to terminals when it could transform entire cities? Engineers sketched plans for networks of moving walkways threading through downtown districts, residential neighbourhoods, shopping centres. Every street would become a conveyor, every block a platform, the whole city in constant synchronised motion. Pedestrians would never tire. Elderly residents could travel easily. Parents with strollers, shoppers with packages, everyone would benefit from a transportation system that required no effort, no fuel, no thought. Some designs went further. Elevated moving sidewalks, stacked in layers above regular streets, each level moving at increasing speeds. You would step onto the slowest level, ride it to the next, transfer to a faster belt, then another, accelerating smoothly until you reached highway speeds, all while standing perfectly still. At your destination, you would reverse the process, stepping down through slower and slower levels, until you gently arrived, never breaking stride. Children imagined racing along these sidewalks, jumping between speeds, treating the city like a giant amusement park. Adults imagined commuting without cars, without crowded buses, without the exhaustion of walking blocks in business shoes. Efficiency and comfort combined. The future would move beneath your feet. The technology seemed achievable. Motors existed. Conveyor systems worked in factories. Materials strong enough to support thousands of people were being developed. It was just a matter of scale, of coordination, of cities willing to invest in infrastructure that would pay dividends in convenience, in reduced traffic, in reclaimed time. No one worried much about maintenance, about what happened when a belt broke down during rush hour, stranding thousands, about debris, about weather, about the sheer complexity of keeping miles of moving machinery operational 24 hours a day. Those were engineering problems, and engineers, everyone believed, loved solving problems. The vision was irresistible, cities that flowed, that carried residents effortlessly through daily life, that eliminated the drudgery of walking while preserving the freedom of not being enclosed in vehicles. It was public transportation reimagined, democratized, made invisible and universal. And it was not just about practicality. It was about what the future should feel like. Modern, streamlined, effortless. A world where technology did not demand attention, but simply worked, quietly, efficiently, carrying humanity forward without asking anything in return, except the willingness to stand still and trust the motion. The 1950s stood on stationary sidewalks, walked tired miles in uncomfortable shoes, and dreamed of a city that moved for them. A city where progress was not something you chased, but something that carried you along, gentle and constant as a river. It never quite happened. But for a while, the dream rolled forward, smooth and unstoppable as the belts they imagined beneath their feet. The 1950s telephone was a marvellous invention, but it had one glaring flaw. You could not see the person on the other end. You could hear them, sure, their voice crackling through copper wires stretched across miles of farmland and forest. But you could not watch their face. You could not read their expressions. And so, naturally, the future would fix this. The year 2000 would bring video phones. The concept was elegant. A telephone with a screen, a small television built into the receiver, showing the person you were talking to live in real time. You would dial, they would answer, and suddenly you would be face to face despite the distance. It was connection elevated, intimacy restored, communication made complete. Illustrations showed families gathered around videophone consoles, waving at grandparents who lived across the country, seeing their smiles, watching them laugh, almost, feeling present in their living rooms. Businessmen would conduct meetings without travelling, seeing colleagues' reactions, reading body language, making decisions with the full context that voices alone could not provide. Long-distance relationships would feel less distant. Deployed soldiers could see their families, not just hear them. The technology was already being demonstrated. Prototypes existed, clunky devices with small screens and grainy images, but functional, proof that video transmission was possible. Television was becoming common. Cameras were getting smaller. Put them together, add telephone lines, and video phones became not just plausible but inevitable. Engineers promised it was coming. The infrastructure needed upgrading, sure, telephone lines capable of carrying video signals, more bandwidth, better cameras, clearer screens. But those were solvable problems. Technology advanced quickly. What seemed impossible in 1950 would be routine by 2000. No, one anticipated the complications, that people might not want to be seen every time they answered the phone, that casual calls, the kind you made while cooking dinner or folding laundry, would require suddenly being camera-ready. That privacy would become performance, that every conversation would carry the pressure of appearance. No one considered that seeing someone's face might not always improve communication, that sometimes people wanted distance, wanted the anonymity of voice alone, wanted the freedom to pace, to gesture wildly, to talk without being watched. That intimacy required more than visibility. The 1950s only saw the benefits. Grandparents could watch grandchildren grow. Deaf individuals could read lips. Doctors could examine patients remotely. Teachers could instruct students from anywhere. The videophone would collapse distance, erase separation, make the world smaller and more connected. It was beautiful in theory. A future where technology brought people together not just through sound but through sight, where calls became visits, where distance stopped mattering because faces could cross any gap. The videophone represented everything the era believed about progress, that technology would always bring people closer, would always improve connection, would always make life richer and more meaningful, and they were right, partially. Video calls did arrive, decades later, exactly as predicted. But they came with complexities the 1950s never imagined, with exhaustion from constant visibility, with the strange discomfort of watching yourself while talking, with the realization that seeing everything does not always mean understanding more. But in the 1950s, those complications were invisible. The dream was simple: phones that showed faces, communication perfected, distance defeated, and that dream glowed bright and clear as the small screens they imagined installing in every home. If flying cars seemed too complicated, too far-fetched, there was always a backup plan: personal helicopters, small, affordable, easy to park. In the 1950s imagination, every suburban garage would eventually house one, folded neatly beside the lawnmower and the Christmas decorations, ready to whisk families to work, to school, to weekend getaways in the mountains. Helicopters already existed. Military versions proved their worth in Korea, rescuing wounded soldiers, delivering supplies, operating in terrain where planes could not land. If helicopters could handle war zones, surely they could handle commutes. Scale them down, simplify the controls, make them affordable, and you had personal air transportation, practical and proven. The illustration showed exactly that. Compact helicopters, sleek and modern, with bubble canopies and simple joystick controls, perched in driveways like oversized lawn ornaments. Families loading luggage into cargo compartments. Fathers piloting confidently while mothers checked maps, and children pressed their faces against curved windows watching the ground drop away. The appeal was obvious. Helicopters did not need runways. They landed anywhere, in backyards, on rooftops, in parking lots. They flew directly, point to point, no roads required, no traffic to navigate. A trip that took 2 hours by car could take 20 minutes by helicopter, straight over hills and rivers and suburbs, arriving exactly where you needed to be. Engineers thought it was feasible. Helicopter technology was maturing. Engines were getting more reliable, more efficient. Safety systems were improving. The military was training thousands of pilots, proving that ordinary people could learn to fly rotorcraft with proper instruction. Why not extend that training to civilians? Why not make helicopter licenses as common as driver's licenses? Some designs went smaller, one-person helicopters, backpack-sized, almost like powered umbrellas. You would strap in, spin up the rotors, lift off. Commuting would become flying, solo and free. No vehicle required beyond what you wore. It was the jetpack's cousin, slightly more grounded, slightly more realistic, still absolutely futuristic. Manufacturers started building prototypes, small helicopters designed for civilian use, marketed to families, to commuters, to anyone tired of traffic. Some even went into limited production, sold to enthusiasts willing to spend serious money on the promise of personal flight. But the dream of mass adoption, of helicopters as common as station wagons, never materialized, because the complications were enormous. Helicopters were loud, deafeningly loud, especially in numbers. Imagine entire neighborhoods lifting off at 8 in the morning, thousands of rotors beating the air, drowning out conversation, birdsong thought itself. Noise regulations would become impossible to enforce. And then there was safety. Helicopters were complex machines, demanding constant attention, precise control, immediate reaction to changing conditions. One mistake, one moment of distraction, and you fell. Engines failed, rotors jammed, weather shifted. Flying cars at least moved predictably. Helicopters required skill, focus, and a comfort with instability that most people lacked. But the 1950s did not dwell on these concerns. They saw possibility. They saw freedom. They saw families rising above the mundane, literally escaping the confines of roads and schedules and traffic jams. They saw a future where the sky belonged to everyone, where flight was not privilege but routine. And for a brief moment in magazine pages and showroom floors, that future felt close. Close enough to touch, close enough to believe, close enough to build a garage with extra vertical clearance just in case. Atomic energy was the miracle fuel of the 1950s, the solution to every problem, the key to unlimited power. It would light your home, warm your bath, cook your dinner, fuel your car. In the year 2000, people believed, everything would run on atoms, clean, efficient, infinite, a glowing future powered by science. The atom had proven itself. Atomic bombs ended wars. Atomic reactors generated electricity. Scientists spoke of atomic energy with reverence, describing it as millions of times more powerful than coal, than oil, than anything humanity had used before. A single pound of uranium contained energy equivalent to thousands of tons of fossil fuel. The implications were staggering. Magazines illustrated this future enthusiastically. Atomic-powered homes, compact reactors in basements, no larger than furnaces, producing all the energy a family needed for years without refueling. Atomic cars, sleek vehicles with miniature reactors under the hood, driving coast to coast without stopping for gas. Atomic planes, atomic trains, atomic ships, all humming quietly on nuclear fuel, pollution-free, endlessly efficient. Even small appliances would go atomic. Atomic toasters, atomic vacuum cleaners, atomic lawn mowers, every device powered by its own tiny reactor, self-sufficient, maintenance-free, operating for decades without replacement. It was the dream of perpetual motion made real, energy so abundant it stopped being a consideration. Engineers encouraged this vision. Nuclear power plants were being built, proving the technology viable. Research reactors dotted the country, powering universities, naval vessels, experimental facilities. The science worked. The energy was real. It was just a matter of miniaturization, of making reactors small enough, safe enough, cheap enough for consumer use. Some predictions went further. Atomic batteries that never died. Installed once, they would power devices for lifetimes, for generations. Your children would inherit flashlights still glowing, radios still playing, clocks still ticking, all running on energy released atom by atom, decay by decay, steady as sunrise. The environmental benefits seemed obvious. No more coal smoke, no more oil spills, no more pollution blackening cities, choking lungs, dimming skies. Atomic energy was clean, they believed, producing power without burning, without waste, without the filth of combustion. It was progress made visible, a future where energy flowed abundantly without cost to the planet. No one talked much about radiation, about meltdowns, contamination, waste that remained dangerous for thousands of years. Those concerns existed, whispered among scientists, debated in technical journals, but they did not reach the public imagination. The 1950s saw atoms as salvation, not threat, as promise, not peril, because the promise was magnificent, a world freed from energy scarcity, where power was too cheap to meter, so abundant that billing customers made no sense, where light stayed on forever, where heat never ran out, where machines never stopped. It was abundance incarnate, the ultimate victory over limitation. Cities would glow, brighter. Factories would run continuously. Homes would stay warm in winter, cool in summer, comfortable always, energy pouring endlessly from reactors the size of suitcases. Poverty would ease because energy poverty would vanish. Development would accelerate because power would be universal. The atomic age would lift all boats, illuminate all corners, energize all dreams. The 1950s believed this completely. They stood in homes lit by incandescent bulbs, heated by coal furnaces, and imagined a future where energy was no longer earned or conserved but simply available, infinite, atomic. They believed science had unlocked something fundamental, something that would reshape civilization as profoundly as fire, as the wheel, as electricity itself. And they were partially right. Atomic energy did transform the world, did power cities, did prove abundant, but it came with complications they never predicted, with costs they never calculated, with risks that made the dream more fragile than the glowing illustration suggested. Still, the vision remained. The vision of limitless power, of homes and cars and lives energized by atoms, humming quietly, glowing steadily, promising a future where energy was never the obstacle, never the limit, never the concern. It was a beautiful dream, and for one shining moment, it felt absolutely inevitable. The moon was no longer a mystery by the end of the 1950s. It was a destination. And if astronauts could go, why not everyone else? By the year 2000, people imagined space travel would be routine, affordable, as ordinary as catching a train. Families would vacation on the moon. Honeymooners would orbit Mars. The stars would belong to everyone. The logic felt unshakable. Aviation followed the same path. First, daring pioneers in fragile machines, then military applications, then commercial flights. Finally, ordinary people boarding planes as casually as buses, crossing continents for business, for pleasure, for family visits. Space would follow the same trajectory, just give it time. Illustrations showed this future vividly. Families in comfortable spacesuits, boarding rockets shaped like streamlined bullets, settling into padded seats for the journey to lunar resorts. Hotels on the moon, built under transparent domes, offering low-gravity swimming pools, observation decks with Earth hanging overhead, restaurants serving meals with a view no earthly establishment could match. Children would press their faces against portholes, watching Earth shrink, seeing stars appear without atmosphere to dim them, experiencing weightlessness like a carnival ride that never ended. Parents would relax, knowing space travel had become safe, reliable, proven by decades of commercial operation. It would be adventure without danger, exploration without risk. The moon was just the beginning. Mars beckoned. Venus waited. Jupiter's moons offered mystery. By the year 2000, the 1950s, believed humanity would have outposts throughout the solar system, colonies on multiple worlds, populations scattered across planets like settlers spreading across a frontier. Space cruise ships would tour the asteroid belt. Mining operations would harvest resources from lifeless rocks. Scientists would conduct research in zero gravity, in conditions impossible on Earth, unlocking discoveries that would revolutionize medicine, materials, manufacturing. The solar system would become humanity's backyard, explored and exploited and settled. Ticket prices would drop. Rockets would launch daily, hourly, as frequently as airplanes, each carrying hundreds of passengers, tourists and business people and adventurers, all heading into space with the same casual confidence people brought to train stations. Space travel agencies would advertise weekend getaways to the moon, 2-week tours of Mars, honeymoon packages featuring zero-gravity romance. Engineers supported this vision. Rocket. Technology was advancing rapidly. The space race was pushing innovation, forcing breakthroughs, proving that humans could leave Earth, could survive in vacuum, could travel between worlds. Every successful launch made the next one easier. Every returned astronaut proved space was survivable. It was just a matter of scaling up, of making rockets reusable, of building infrastructure. No one anticipated how hard space would remain, how expensive, how dangerous, how the physics that made leaving Earth difficult did not ease with time, how rockets would always require enormous energy, careful engineering, constant vigilance. How space tourism would arrive, eventually, but remain luxury, not routine, accessible to the wealthy, not the masses. But the 1950s did not see obstacles. They saw acceleration. They saw progress compounding, technology building on technology, each generation pushing further than the last. If humanity reached the moon by 1970, surely Mars would, follow by 1980, Europa by 1990, the stars themselves by 2000. It was optimism unbound. Optimism that believed limitations were temporary, that human ingenuity could overcome gravity, distance, radiation, vacuum, everything that made space hostile, that the universe was not a barrier but an invitation, not a void but a destination, not empty but waiting. And so they dreamed of boarding rockets the way they boarded trains, of watching Earth recede through windows, of stepping onto alien soil, planting flags, building homes, starting fresh on worlds where history had not yet written its scars. They dreamed of humanity unshackled from a single planet, spread across the heavens, infinite and free. It was the biggest dream of all, and sitting in their living rooms watching rockets rise on black and white televisions, they believed it completely. The dream was simple, a house that knew what you needed before you did. Lights that turned on when you entered a room, thermostats that adjusted themselves, doors that opened at your approach, beds that made themselves, coffee that brewed on schedule. In the year 2000, your home would not just shelter you, it would anticipate you. The 1950s householder, fumbling for light switches in the dark, adjusting thermostats manually every few hours, locking and unlocking doors with actual keys, looked at this daily routine and saw inefficiency, wasted motion, wasted time. Technology they believed could eliminate all of it. The house itself could think. Illustrations showed homes bristling with sensors, invisible eyes watching every room, monitoring temperature, detecting movement, learning patterns. The family that woke at 7 would find lights brightening gradually at 6:50, easing them into consciousness. Coffee would begin percolating at 6:55, filling the kitchen with warm, welcoming aroma. The thermostat would raise the temperature just enough to make leaving bed less painful. Throughout the day, the house would adjust. Lights dimming in empty rooms, conserving energy. Shades lowering when sunlight became too bright, raising when clouds passed. The oven preheating at exactly the right moment, ready when you walked into the kitchen. Doors unlocking as you approached, recognizing your footsteps, your presence, your right to enter. It was not just convenience, it was partnership. The house as collaborator, as silent servant, as entity that existed to smooth the rough edges of daily life. You would never search for keys, never wonder if you locked the door, never walk into dark rooms fumbling along walls. The house would handle everything. Engineers believed it was achievable. Automation already existed in factories, in assembly lines where machines performed complex sequences without human intervention. Sensors detected temperature, pressure, movement. Timers controlled processes. Combine these technologies, miniaturize them, install them. Throughout a home, and you created intelligence distributed through walls and floors and ceilings. Some designs went further. Houses that monitored health, bathrooms with scales that tracked weight, mirrors that analyzed complexion, toilets that tested for illness. The house would know when you were getting sick before you did, would adjust environment to promote healing, would contact doctors if necessary. It would protect you from yourself, from neglect, from the 1,000 small oversights that accumulated into larger problems. Kitchens would manage inventory. Refrigerators would track food, noting when milk ran low, when bread went stale, when vegetables needed using. The house would compile shopping lists automatically. would order groceries, would ensure you never ran out of essentials. Meal planning would become collaborative, the kitchen suggesting recipes based on available ingredients, on dietary preferences, on what you ate yesterday and the day before. Bedrooms would monitor sleep. Mattresses would adjust firmness throughout the night, responding to position changes, to restlessness, to the shifting needs of sleeping bodies. Temperature would modulate, warmer when you first lay down, cooler as sleep deepened, perfect always. Alarms would time themselves to sleep cycles, waking you during light sleep rather than dragging you from dreams. Children imagined houses that played with them, walls that changed colour on command, rooms that rearranged themselves, furniture gliding into new configurations for games, for parties, for whatever the moment required. It was architecture made fluid, responsive, alive. Adults imagined houses that handled maintenance, systems that detected leaks before they became floods, that identified electrical problems before they became fires, that scheduled their own repairs, contacted their own technicians, fixed themselves, or arranged fixing without human intervention. Home ownership would shed its anxiety, its constant vigilance, its parade of small crises. No one worried about privacy, about living in a house that watched constantly, that recorded every movement, every habit, every pattern. About who controlled that information, who could access it, what happened when the house knew too much. Those concerns felt paranoid compared to the dream of effortless living. No one worried about dependence either, about what happened when automation failed, when sensors broke, when the thinking house stopped thinking, about whether people would forget how to do things the house normally handled, whether skills would atrophy, whether self-sufficiency would become obsolete. The 1950s only saw liberation, saw technology freeing humanity from drudgery, from repetitive tasks, from the endless maintenance that home ownership demanded. The automated house was not about laziness. It was about reclaiming attention, about focusing on what mattered, about letting machines handle the predictable so humans could handle the meaningful. And so they dreamed of homes that welcomed them, that knew them, that cared for them in quiet, invisible ways. Homes that were not just buildings but partners, not just shelter but intelligence, not just spaces but entities devoted entirely to making life easier. It was a warm dream, a comforting dream, and sitting in homes that required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant work, they believed it was coming. Pollution bothered people in the 1950s. Smog hung over cities like a grim blanket. Factory smoke darkened skies. Car exhaust made eyes water. So they imagined a solution. Domes. Enormous transparent domes covering entire cities, sealing them off from the mess outside. Inside, the air would be perfect. Filtered. Climate-controlled. Breathable. The concept appeared in illustrations like something from science fiction, which it essentially was, though the 1950s refused to acknowledge the fiction part. Vast hemispheres of glass or plastic, or some yet-to-be-invented transparent material, arching over downtowns, over residential neighbourhoods, over entire municipalities. Sunlight would penetrate, rain would bead and roll off, and inside, protected from weather, from pollution, from the chaotic atmosphere, life would continue in controlled comfort. The appeal was immediate. Cities were getting dirtier. Industrial growth meant more factories, more smokestacks, more particles floating in air that used to be clear. Cars multiplied, each one adding exhaust to the collective haze. Breathing urban air increasingly meant inhaling things lungs were never designed to process. The dome offered escape without evacuation, protection without abandonment. Inside the dome, air would be manufactured, filtered, purified, enriched with oxygen, maintained at perfect temperature and humidity. No more sweltering summers, no more frigid winters, no more seasonal allergies, no more smog alerts, no more checking wind direction before hanging, laundry. Just consistent, perfect, breathable atmosphere engineered and controlled. Some designs included multiple climate zones within a single dome. Downtown might be kept cooler, optimized for business suits and brisk walking. Residential areas would run warmer, comfortable for families. Parks would have their own settings, slightly humid to help plants thrive, slightly breezy to mimic natural conditions. The dome would not just protect but customize, offering different environments for different needs. Engineers took this seriously. Dome construction was not fantasy. Geodesic domes existed, invented by Buckminster Fuller, proven capable of spanning large spaces with minimal material. Scale them up, strengthen them, make them transparent, and you had the basic structure. Add air handling systems, pressure regulation, environmental controls, and you had a city dome. Challenging but conceivable. The benefits extended beyond air quality. Domed cities would be quieter, sound would not, carriers far, would not echo off distant buildings, would not accumulate into urban roar. Rain would become spectacle rather than inconvenience, something to watch from inside, drumming on the dome overhead, visible but impotent. Snow the same, beautiful but powerless to disrupt traffic, to cancel plans, to make sidewalks treacherous. Energy efficiency would improve dramatically. Heating a dome was easier than heating individual buildings, cooling likewise. The controlled environment would reduce energy waste, would make climate control centralized and efficient. Costs would drop, comfort would rise, technology would triumph over weather's tyranny. Children imagined living under domes like living in snow globes, everything visible, everything contained, safe from storms and wind and the frightening unpredictability of open sky. Adults imagined it as civilization perfected, humanity finally asserting control over environment, finally creating spaces designed for human thriving rather than human endurance. No one dwelled on claustrophobia, on what it would feel like living under permanent enclosure, never feeling unfiltered wind, never seeing unlimited sky, always aware of the barrier between inside and outside, on whether the psychological cost of separation from natural atmosphere might outweigh the physical benefits of purified air. No one considered catastrophic failure. What happened if a dome cracked during a storm? If pressure regulation failed? If the environmental system stopped working, leaving thousands trapped under glass with air turning stale, temperature rising, panic spreading? The engineering challenges of maintaining life support for entire cities barely entered the conversation. The 1950s saw only improvement, saw humanity building better environments, cleaner environments, controlled environments where variables were managed and optimized. The dome was not cage but sanctuary, not limitation but protection, not barrier but blessing. And so they imagined cities sealed under crystal, skylines visible through transparent shells, populations breathing air as pure as mountain streams, living in perfect climate regardless of season or geography. They imagined looking up and seeing not sky but dome, not clouds but ceiling, and feeling not confined but safe. It was paradise engineered, it was nature tamed, and sitting in smoggy cities, breathing air that tasted of coal smoke and exhaust, they wanted it desperately. The mail travelled through pneumatic tubes. Documents whooshed from office to office, propelled by air pressure, arriving seconds later with a satisfying thump. In the 1950s, people looked at this system and thought, why stop at mail? Why not people? By the year 2000, they imagined you would step into a tube, get sucked through a network of underground tunnels, and emerge across town moments later. The concept was gloriously simple. Pneumatic tubes worked. That was proven. Department stores used them to send cash and receipts between floors. Banks used them at drive-thrus. Offices used them for internal communication. The technology was reliable, fast, efficient. It just needed scaling. Make the tubes larger, strengthen them for human cargo, add safety features, and you had instant transportation. Illustrations showed sleek capsules shaped like bullets, transparent so passengers could see the tunnel walls rushing past. You would enter at a station, select your destination, settle into cushioned seats, doors would seal, air pressure would build, and suddenly you would be moving, accelerating through underground tubes, racing beneath city streets at speeds no car could match, arriving at your destination in minutes regardless of distance. Commuting would transform. No more sitting in traffic, no more waiting for buses, no more crowded subways. Just step into a tube station, slide into a capsule, and shoot across town faster than thought. A trip that took an hour by car would take 5 minutes by tube. The city would contract, distances would collapse, neighborhoods would connect. Engineers believed it was possible. Pressure differential moved objects reliably. Tunnels could be built. Underground infrastructure already existed for subways and utilities. Capsules could be designed for safety, for comfort, for the unique stresses of pneumatic transportation. It was not simple, certainly, but neither was it impossible. Just expensive, just ambitious, just waiting for funding and will. Some designs included networks connecting cities, tubes stretching hundreds of miles, capsules shooting between urban centres at airplane speeds, delivering passengers from New York to Chicago in under an hour, from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 20 minutes. Intercity travel would become trivial. Daily commutes could span states. Geography would stop mattering. The experience would be unique. Acceleration pressing you back into seats, then weightlessness as the capsule coasted, then gentle deceleration as you approached your station. The tunnel walls would blur past, light streaking by, the whole journey feeling like being shot from a cannon, thrilling and slightly terrifying and absolutely modern. Children would love it. The speed, the novelty, the sense of being launched like a rocket without leaving the ground. Adults would appreciate the efficiency, the reliability, the elimination of traffic and weather, and all the variables that made traditional transportation frustrating. Pneumatic tubes would be democracy in motion, fast transportation available to everyone, regardless of income, regardless of car ownership. Cargo would travel the same network. Packages, groceries, furniture, anything that fit in a capsule, delivered across town in minutes rather than hours. Shipping would accelerate. Supply chains would compress. Cities would become more connected, more fluid, more integrated. No one talked much about nausea, about whether human bodies could handle rapid acceleration, sudden stops, continuous high-speed travel through tight spaces. About whether the experience would feel more theme park ride than transportation, exciting once but exhausting daily. About whether people wanted to travel sealed in capsules, unable to change routes, unable to stop, committed to the journey once the tube activated. No one considered the infrastructure cost. Miles of tubes crisscrossing beneath cities, beneath countryside, maintaining vacuum or pressure differential, preventing leaks, ensuring safety. The engineering would be staggering, the expense enormous, the maintenance constant. But those details felt secondary to the vision, because the vision was spectacular. Cities connected by tubes like neurons in a brain, capsules zipping through them like electrical impulses, thought made physical, distance made meaningless. It was speed incarnate, efficiency perfected, transportation reimagined as something closer to teleportation than travel. The 1950s looked at mail tubes and saw potential. saw themselves inside those tubes, saw the future rushing past at blinding speed, saw arrival happening before departure finished registering. They saw cities linked, populations mobile, geography conquered by pressure and engineering, and the simple audacity of asking, why not? It never happened. Pneumatic tubes remained small, specialized, limited to documents and small items. But the dream persisted, the dream of instant travel, of tubes beneath the earth carrying humanity faster than seemed possible, faster than seemed necessary, fast enough to feel like magic. Automation would handle the labor, robots would do the work, machines would manage production, and humans would finally be free to relax, to create, to enjoy life. By the year 2000, the 1950s believed, the work week would shrink to 3 days, maybe 2. The rest of the time would belong to leisure, hobbies, long vacations, pursuits of the mind and spirit. The logic was unassailable, productivity was increasing. Machines accomplished in hours what previously took days. Automation multiplied output. Computers handled calculations that once required armies of clerks. If technology kept advancing, kept multiplying human capability, eventually most work would become unnecessary. Machines would produce abundance. Humans would enjoy it. Economists supported this vision. They calculated productivity gains, projected automation curves, and concluded that material production would eventually require minimal human labor. The 40-hour work week, standard in the 1950s, would seem barbaric by 2000, an artifact of less efficient times like child labor or 6-day work weeks. Magazines illustrated the coming leisure. Families spending Tuesday at the beach, not because it was vacation, but because it was Tuesday. Parents attending children's school events without requesting time off. Hobbyists pursuing passions with a dedication previously reserved for careers. Painters painting, musicians practicing, gardeners gardening. Not as side projects squeezed into evenings and weekends, but as central activities, given time, given attention, given respect. The 3-day work week would be enough. Technology would make workers so productive that 3 days would accomplish what previously required 5 or 6. Monday through Wednesday, you worked. Thursday through Sunday, you lived. It was balance restored, priorities corrected, human flourishing enabled rather than deferred. Some predictions went further. 2-day work weeks, 1 day. Eventually work would become optional, something people did because they enjoyed it, because they wanted purpose, because they craved contribution, not because survival demanded it. Universal basic income would flow from automated production. Necessities would be abundant and cheap. People would work only if work itself brought satisfaction. Children growing up in this future would barely understand the concept of full-time employment. Their grandparents' stories about working 50 weeks a year, 8 hours a day, would sound like tales from darker ages. They would spend their youth learning, exploring, developing talents, preparing for lives that emphasize creation and experience rather than production and consumption. Adults imagine reclaiming time stolen by work, time for relationships, for friendships, for community involvement, for political participation, for artistic expression, for physical health, for mental well-being, for all the things that make life meaningful but get pushed aside by employment's demands. The shorter work week would not make people lazy. It would make them whole. Retirement would transform, or rather disappear. When work only consumed 3 days weekly, retirement became unnecessary. People would continue contributing at whatever pace felt sustainable, would never face the abrupt transition from employment to idleness, would remain engaged and purposeful throughout their lives. Society would shift. Communities would strengthen because people had time for them. Democracy would deepen because citizens had time for engagement. Culture would flourish because artists had time for creation. Problems would get solved because people had time for solutions. The 3-day work week was not just about individual freedom. It was about collective transformation. No one anticipated resistance, that some people would want to work more, would define themselves through employment, would feel lost with too much leisure, that industries would resist reducing hours, that capitalism would find ways to fill reclaimed time with consumption, that productivity gains would enrich employers rather than freeing employees. No one imagined that technology could multiply productivity while simultaneously creating new forms of work, new demands, new expectations that kept hours constant even as output increased. That email would tether people to jobs beyond office walls, that smartphones would make work inescapable, that the future would bring constant connectivity rather than abundant leisure. The 1950s believed in the promise, believed technology served humanity, that progress meant liberation, that the arc of innovation bent toward freedom. They worked their 40-hour weeks, dreamed of 3-day work weeks, and trusted that the future would deliver. It was a beautiful vision. Work as brief interruption rather than defining activity. Life as expansive space rather than squeezed margins. Time as abundance rather than scarcity. And somewhere, in factories and offices and homes across America, people believed it was coming, believed it was inevitable, believed that the future would finally give them what the present never could. Time. Simply time. Teachers were wonderful, patient, knowledgeable, but they were human. They got tired. They got sick. They could only teach so many students at once. In the year 2000, the 1950s imagined machines would take over. Teaching machines, programmed with every fact, every lesson, every answer. Students would sit at individual consoles, learning at their own pace, guided by technology that never lost patience. The classroom of the future would look nothing like the classroom of the present. No more rows of desks facing a blackboard. No more one teacher attempting to reach 30 students with different abilities, different backgrounds, different learning speeds. Instead, individual learning stations, each with a screen, a keyboard, a machine programmed to teach. Students would arrive, sit at their assigned console and begin. The machine would assess their current knowledge, identify gaps, customize lessons accordingly. A student struggling with fractions would get additional practice, different explanations, infinite patience. A student who grasped concepts quickly would advance, immediately, never waiting for classmates, never bored by repetition designed for others. The machine would never get frustrated, never play favourites, never judge. It would simply teach, tirelessly, perfectly, adapting to each student's needs. Slow learners would finally get attention they needed. Fast learners would finally be challenged. Everyone would learn at optimal pace, education customized rather than standardized. Teachers would not disappear entirely. They would transition from lecturers to facilitators, from sources of information to guides and mentors. They would help students navigate material, would provide encouragement, would handle the human elements machines could not. But the heavy lifting of information transfer, of drill and practice, of basic instruction would belong to machines. Efficiency would skyrocket. Students could progress through material faster, freed from waiting for class consensus. Subjects could be mastered in months rather than years. Education would compress. Students graduating younger, entering workforce or higher education earlier, their youth reclaimed from unnecessarily slow instruction. Testing would become continuous and invisible. The machine would constantly assess understanding, would know exactly what each student knew and did not know. No more anxiety-inducing exams. No more studying for tests. Just ongoing evaluation, built into the learning process, providing feedback immediately, correcting misunderstandings before they calcified. The machines would teach everything: math, science, history, languages, literature, all programmed in, all available, all accessible. Students could explore subjects beyond standard curriculum, could follow interest without needing specialized teachers, could become experts in obscure topics simply because the machine knew everything and could teach anything. Some designs included audio-visual components, screens showing diagrams, animations, video demonstrations. History would come alive through footage, science through simulations, geography through virtual travel. Learning would engage multiple senses, would feel less like study and more like experience. Parents imagined their children getting better educations than they received. Educations uncompromised by teacher shortages, by overcrowded classrooms, by budget constraints that limited resources. The teaching machine was equalizer, providing the same quality instruction to every student regardless of location, regardless of school funding, regardless of local teacher availability. No one worried about losing human connection, about whether children needed more than information transfer, needed relationships with teachers, needed role models and mentors and adults who cared about them personally, whether learning was social, collaborative, enhanced by peer interaction and discussion and the messy human dynamics of classrooms. No one considered whether machines could teach creativity, critical thinking, ethics, wisdom, the subtle human qualities that matter more than facts. Whether education was about more than knowledge acquisition, about becoming thoughtful citizens, compassionate people, individuals capable of navigating complexity with judgment and care. The 1950s saw inefficiency in human teaching and imagined machines solving it, saw students held back by outdated methods and imagined technology liberating them, saw the future classroom as quiet rows of consoles, each student engaged with their personal teaching machine, learning faster and better than ever before. It was optimization applied to education. It was progress quantified in reduced learning time, increased information retention, measurable improvement. And sitting in overcrowded classrooms with overwhelmed teachers, students and parents alike found it appealing. The dream of perfect instruction, customized and patient, delivered by machines that knew everything and never got tired. It promised so much, and like many promises made to technology, it overlooked the irreplaceable value of what it planned to replace. Laundry was exhausting. Washing, drying, folding, ironing, an endless cycle that devoured hours. So the 1950s looked ahead and imagined a future where laundry did not exist. Clothes would be disposable, made from cheap, lightweight materials, paper perhaps, or some yet-to-be-invented fabric. You would wear an outfit once, toss it, and pull a fresh one from a box. The concept appeared in advertisements and magazine articles, illustrated with housewives gleefully throwing dresses into trash cans, smiling with the liberation of never doing laundry again. Disposable clothing would come in packages, sealed and sterile, ready to wear. You would select an outfit each morning the way you selected cereal, from abundant options requiring no maintenance. Paper clothing already existed in limited form. Disposable hospital gowns, promotional dresses distributed at events. They were not comfortable, not durable, but they proved the concept. Make the material better, the design more sophisticated, the cost lower, and disposable clothing would become practical, desirable, inevitable. The benefits seemed obvious. No more sorting colours, no more pre-treating stains, no more shrinking sweaters or bleeding dyes or garments ruined by washing. Clothes would be perfect when you put them on, would stay perfect for their single wear, would disappear afterward without demanding attention, time or detergent. Travel would simplify dramatically. Pack disposable clothing instead of planning outfits, calculating wears, worrying about laundry access. arrive at your destination, wear fresh clothes daily, discard them, return home with empty luggage. No more hauling dirty clothes across continents, no more hotel sink washing, no more dragging suitcases heavier than when you left. Children's clothing particularly would benefit. Kids stained everything, outgrew everything, destroyed everything. Disposable clothing would eliminate the heartbreak of ruined outfits, the expense of constant replacement, the frustration of trying to remove mystery stains from garments worn once. Let them play in dirt. Let them paint, climb trees, live fully. The clothes would be trash anyway. Fashion would democratize. Trendy styles would be affordable because they were temporary. Everyone could wear the latest designs, could change styles frequently, could experiment without commitment. Wardrobes would expand endlessly, limited only by storage space, freed from the constraint of clothing as investment. Some designs imagine customization. Disposable clothes ordered with your measurements, delivered in your preferred colours, your chosen styles, perfectly fitted, perfectly personal, perfectly temporary. Manufacturing would be automated, production costs minimal, distribution simple as mail delivery. No one talked about waste, about mountains of discarded clothing, accumulating, about landfills overflowing with paper dresses and synthetic shirts, about environmental impact of producing and disposing billions of garments designed for single use. The 1950s did not think in terms of waste, of limits, of consequences beyond immediate convenience. No one considered whether people would want disposable clothing, whether the act of caring for garments, of maintaining them, of developing relationships with favourite outfits mattered, whether clothing as temporary consumer good rather than durable possession would feel empty, unsatisfying, wasteful even to those it supposedly served. No one imagined that the future would move towards sustainability rather than disposability, that environmental awareness would make single-use anything seem short-sighted, that people would eventually value durability and reusability over convenience and novelty. The 1950s saw laundry as problem, disposable clothing as solution. They saw freedom from maintenance, liberation from drudgery, modernity expressed through impermanence. They imagined pulling on fresh clothes each morning, crisp and perfect, discarding them each night, never touching detergent, never standing at ironing boards, never folding endlessly. It was convenience taken to logical extreme. It was domestic labour eliminated through radical redefinition of what clothing could be. And to a generation that spent hours weekly maintaining wardrobes, that scrubbed stains and mended tears and ironed wrinkles, it sounded magnificent. The dream was simple. Wear it once, throw it away, never think about laundry again. And for a moment in that optimistic decade, it seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Just one more way technology would liberate humanity from age-old burdens. Earth was getting crowded. The population was growing. Resources were finite. The solution, obviously, was expansion. Not just into space, but onto other worlds. By the year 2000, people believed humanity would have colonies on the moon, settlements on Mars, thriving communities among the stars, places where pioneers could start fresh. The moon would be first, closest, most accessible, most familiar. By the 1980s, they predicted lunar bases would exist, small outposts housing scientists and technicians, proving humanity could survive beyond Earth. By the 1990s, those bases would expand, becoming towns, then cities, populations growing, infrastructure developing, the moon transforming from destination to home. Illustrations showed domed settlements, transparent bubbles protecting colonists from vacuum, from radiation, from the airless lunar surface. Inside, trees would grow in manufactured soil, parks would offer recreation, homes would provide comfort. Life would continue, recognizably human. just relocated to alien ground. Mining would drive initial development. The moon contained resources, metals, minerals, materials that could be extracted and used locally or shipped to Earth. Lunar industry would build lunar infrastructure, would employ lunar workers, would create lunar economy. Self-sufficiency would follow naturally, colonies eventually producing everything needed, depending on Earth for nothing. Children would be born on the moon, growing up in low gravity, stronger than Earth children, taller, adapted to their environment. They would be the first generation for whom Earth was foreign, the moon home, their entire lives spent beneath domes, their sky perpetually black, Earth hanging overhead like a blue marble. Mars would follow. Farther, more challenging, more rewarding. The red planet offered land, atmosphere, thin but present, water frozen in polar caps, the potential for terraforming, for transformation into Earth-like world where humans could eventually walk unprotected under open sky. Martian colonies would start small but grow faster than lunar ones, benefiting from lessons learned, from technology refined, from experience gained. Populations would establish themselves in valleys, in canyons, in sites chosen for water access, for solar exposure, for shelter from dust storms. They would build underground initially, using Martian soil for radiation protection, then gradually expand upward as infrastructure allowed. Agriculture would develop in greenhouses, crops grown in Martian soil enriched with imported nutrients or manufactured fertilizers. Eventually, terraforming would begin, releasing greenhouse gases to thicken atmosphere, warming the planet, melting ice, creating conditions where water could flow, where plants could survive outside, where Mars would slowly green. The timeline felt realistic. Rocketry was advancing rapidly. The space race was accelerating innovation. If humanity reached the moon by 1970, surely permanent settlement would follow within decades. Mars by 1990, terraforming by 2000, thriving colonies by 2010. The progression seemed logical, inevitable, driven by the same pioneering spirit that settled continents, crossed oceans, pushed always outward. Immigration would be selective initially, choosing colonists for skills, for health, for psychological resilience, but eventually it would open, become available to anyone willing to accept the risks, to leave Earth permanently, to stake everything on new worlds. Some would go for opportunity, for land unavailable on Earth, for wealth promised by resource extraction. Others for adventure, for challenge, for the fundamental human drive to explore. Governments would fund early colonies, but corporations would follow, attracted by profits, by resources, by opportunities Earth could not offer. Free enterprise would drive expansion, competition would accelerate development, capitalism would colonize space the way it colonized continents. No one adequately considered isolation. The psychological toll of living in sealed environments, of never breathing unfiltered air, of never seeing unenclosed horizons, of being months or years from Earth, with no possibility of quick return, of homesickness, of cabin fever, of conflicts with no escape, of mental health crises in places with no therapists, no support systems, no established ways of helping. No one imagined that space colonization would remain prohibitively expensive, that launching enough material to build self-sufficient colonies would require resources nations were unwilling to commit, that corporations would find easier profits elsewhere, that the dream would remain dream for decades beyond predicted timelines. But the 1950s believed humanity was destined for the stars, that Earth was cradle not grave, that the future belonged to those willing to leave, to build, to pioneer among the planets. They looked at growing populations and saw the solution overhead, glowing in the night sky, waiting for humanity to arrive and claim it. Moon colonies, Martian outposts, the beginning of human expansion across the solar system, across the galaxy, across the universe itself. It was destiny made visible, future written in the positions of planets, invitation extended by every world that orbited every star. And sitting under Earth's sky, looking up at the moon, they believed their grandchildren would be living there, thriving there, building civilizations that would dwarf anything Earth produced. It was the biggest dream, the boldest dream, and it felt absolutely certain. Telephones were fine, video phones would be better, but the ultimate form of communication, the 1950s believed, would bypass technology entirely. By the year 2000, science would unlock telepathy. People would communicate mind to mind, thoughts transmitted instantly, perfectly, without words, without misunderstanding, a direct connection between human consciousness. Research already suggested telepathy might be possible. Experiments in parapsychology, in ESP, in extrasensory perception produced results that scientists found intriguing, if not conclusive. Twins seemed to share thoughts. People reported knowing when loved ones were in danger. Anecdotal evidence abounded. Science just needed to understand the mechanism, to identify the signals, to amplify what nature provided weakly. The brain generated electrical activity. That was proven. Thoughts created measurable patterns. Neurons firing, synapses connecting, consciousness emerging from biological electricity. If thoughts were electrical, they could theoretically be transmitted, received, interpreted. The brain was essentially a radio broadcasting on frequencies science had not yet learned to detect. By the year 2000, researchers predicted that would change. Instruments would become sensitive enough to pick up brainwaves, to decode thought patterns, to translate neural activity into meaning. Initially, machines would mediate, receivers picking up signals, computers interpreting, them displays showing thoughts in text or images. But eventually the process would become direct, brain to brain, consciousness to consciousness, thoughts flowing between minds like conversations. Imagine the possibilities. Communication without language barriers. A Japanese person and an American sharing thoughts directly, meaning transmitted without translation, understanding perfect despite different languages. The deaf and hearing, the mute and speaking, all able to communicate equally, directly, without the limitations of speech or hearing. Relationships would deepen. Lovers could share thoughts, feelings, experiences with perfect fidelity, no more struggling to explain, to describe, to convey. You would simply think, and they would know, would feel what you felt, would understand completely. Misunderstanding would become impossible. Arguments would dissolve in the face of perfect mutual comprehension. Business would accelerate. Meetings conducted telepathically, everyone's, thoughts visible, decisions made collectively and instantly. No more presentations, no more persuasion, just shared understanding leading to consensus. Collaboration would become seamless, teams working in mental sync, each person knowing what others knew, contributing thoughts that integrated immediately into group consciousness. Education would transform. Teachers would transmit knowledge directly into students' minds, concepts grasped instantly, perfectly, without the slow inefficiency of lecture and study. Learning would become downloading, students absorbing subjects in moments rather than months, limited only by how much their minds could process, not by how long teaching took. Some predictions went darker. Government telepathy detectors, ensuring citizens thought correctly, identifying dissent before it became action. Thought police monitoring consciousness, arresting people for mental crimes, eliminating freedom by eliminating privacy's last refuge, But these concerns were whispered, not emphasized. The 1950s preferring optimistic visions, most imagined telepathy as liberation, as connection perfected, as the final barrier between individuals finally removed, consciousness no longer trapped in isolated skulls but able to merge, to share, to experience community at the deepest possible level. Humanity would become partially collective, individual minds capable of temporary union, separation and connection, both possible, both chosen. No one adequately considered whether people wanted this, whether privacy mattered, whether thoughts were meant to be shared, whether the ability to keep some things internal, unspoken, secret, was essential to identity, to dignity, to selfhood. Whether perfect communication might reveal things better left unclear, whether some distance was healthy, whether mystery between people had value. No one imagined that the brain might be too complex, thoughts too nuanced, consciousness too individual for direct transmission, that what felt like a single thought might actually be thousands of simultaneous processes. That meaning emerged from context and association impossible to transfer, that telepathy might be fundamentally incompatible with how minds actually work. But the 1950s believed in progress, in science unlocking every mystery, in technology enabling every capability biology suggested. They saw telepathy as inevitable, as the next step in communication evolution, as humanity's future. And so they imagined a world where thoughts flowed freely between minds, where understanding was perfect, where connection was total, a world where loneliness ended because consciousness itself could merge, where every person could know every other person completely, where humanity became not just social, but telepathically linked. It was the dream of perfect communication, of minds touching directly, of consciousness liberated from the prison of individual skulls, and sitting in living rooms, thinking private thoughts that no one else could access. They believed that would change, that the year 2000 would bring minds together, would dissolve the final barrier, would make humanity one in ways previously impossible. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, and it felt certain. Medicine was advancing rapidly in the 1950s. Vaccines conquered polio, antibiotics fought infections, surgery saved lives. Extrapolating forward, people imagined a year 2000 where disease no longer existed. Cancer cured, heart disease prevented, aging slowed or stopped entirely. Doctors would have tools so advanced that illness became a relic of the past. The logic was compelling. Medical knowledge was accelerating. Each decade brought discoveries that would have seemed miraculous the decade before. Penicillin transformed infection from death sentence to inconvenience. Polio vaccine saved thousands. Organ transplants, impossible a generation earlier, were becoming routine. If progress continued at this pace, total victory over disease seemed inevitable. Cancer would fall first. Research was intense, funding abundant, breakthroughs announced regularly. By the 1970s, they predicted, cancer would be curable, tumours eliminated by radiation, by drugs, by techniques yet to be discovered. By the 1980s, it would be preventable, vaccines or treatments stopping cancer before it started. By 2000, the word itself would be historical, a disease that once killed millions, now extinct. Heart disease would follow. Understanding of cholesterol, of blood pressure, of cardiovascular health was improving. Doctors were identifying risk factors, developing preventive treatments, designing artificial hearts that would replace failing organs. Eventually, heart disease would become optional, something that happened only to those who neglected prevention, who refused available treatments. Genetic diseases would be cured by fixing genes themselves. Scientists were beginning to understand DNA to map chromosomes, to identify genetic causes of illness. Once understanding was complete, modification would follow. Defective genes would be corrected, either before birth or after. Diseases like sickle cell, like haemophilia, like muscular dystrophy, simply edited out of existence. Aging itself would slow, maybe stop. Researchers were beginning to understand cellular aging, to identify mechanisms that cause deterioration. Telomeres, free radicals, accumulated damage, all were being studied, all seemed potentially controllable. By 2000, people imagined living to 100, to 120, to 150, healthy and active, aging postponed indefinitely. Some predictions went further. Immortality. Not metaphorical, not spiritual, but literal biological immortality. Disease conquered, aging stopped, death from illness simply ending. People would still die from accidents, from violence, but not from their own bodies failing, not from the slow decay that claimed every previous generation. Medical technology would become extraordinary. Diagnostic machines that scanned bodies in seconds, identifying every abnormality, every developing problem, catching diseases before symptoms appeared. Surgical robots performing procedures with superhuman precision, never shaking, never tiring, never making mistakes. Drugs designed for individual patients, customized to personal biochemistry, perfectly effective with no side effects. Regeneration would become possible. Lost limbs would regrow, encouraged by treatments that activated dormant cellular capabilities. Damaged organs would repair themselves, guided by drugs that told cells how to rebuild. Even brain damage might be reversible, neurons regrowing, connections reforming, consciousness restored. Mental illness would finally be understood and cured. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, all the conditions that plagued minds would yield to treatments that corrected chemical imbalances, that repaired neural pathways, that restored healthy brain function. The stigma would disappear because the diseases themselves would disappear, cured as completely as infections. Hospitals would shrink, eventually becoming museums, places that displayed the crude tools and desperate measures of earlier medical eras. Most healthcare would happen at home, diagnostic devices checking health daily, automated systems administering treatments, doctors consulted remotely only for complex cases. Life would extend, but more importantly, health span would extend. People would not just live longer but stay healthy longer, remaining active and capable until the very end. The slow deterioration that characterized aging, the decades of declining health, would be compressed into brief final illness or eliminated entirely. No one anticipated complexity, that some diseases would resist every treatment, would evolve faster than cures, would prove more stubborn than optimism suggested, that aging might be too fundamental to biology to simply switch off, that immortality might have costs beyond the technical, might create problems worse than death. No one imagined that new diseases would emerge, that viruses would mutate, that the medical arms race would continue rather than conclude, that antibiotic resistance would develop, that cancer would adapt, that nature would not surrender simply because humanity declared victory. But the 1950s believed in medical progress, in science conquering every ailment, in technology defeating biology's limitations. They sat in doctors' offices, received diagnoses that previous generations could not have treated, and extrapolated forward to a future where all diagnosis led to cure, where all illness met effective treatment, where disease itself became historical curiosity. It was the dream of health perfected, of bodies maintained indefinitely, of death postponed beyond recognition, and in an era where Medicine was saving lives that would have been lost a decade before. It seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The future would be healthy, and it would last forever. Gasoline was expensive, messy, finite. But atomic energy? Atomic energy was limitless. So the 1950s imagined cars powered by tiny nuclear reactors, vehicles that could run for years without refueling, clean, efficient, safe. By the year 2000, gas stations would be gone. Every car would hum quietly along on atomic power. The Ford Nucleon appeared in concept drawings in 1958, a sleek vehicle with a nuclear reactor where the trunk should be. The reactor would generate heat. Heat would produce steam. Steam would drive turbines. Turbines would power the car. Refueling would happen once per year, maybe once per decade, at specialized facilities that swapped out depleted reactor cores for fresh ones. Otherwise, you just drove, endlessly, the atom providing. The advantages were enormous. No more gas stations, no more fuel costs, no more range anxiety. A nuclear car could drive across the country without stopping, could idle indefinitely without wasting fuel, could sit in traffic without concern. The reactor ran constantly, steadily, requiring nothing from the driver except steering. Pollution would plummet. No exhaust, no emissions, no smog. Nuclear cars would be clean in ways gasoline cars could never be, producing power without combustion, without releasing anything into the atmosphere. Cities would clear, air would purify, children would grow up breathing clean instead of exhaust-tainted atmosphere. Engineers believed it was achievable. Nuclear reactors existed, were well understood, were being miniaturized. Submarines ran on nuclear power, proving the technology reliable and safe in confined spaces. If submarines could carry reactors safely beneath oceans, cars could carry them safely on roads. It was just engineering, just refinement, just time. Safety systems would protect against accidents. Reactors would be shielded, preventing radiation leakage. Automatic shutdowns would activate in collisions, preventing meltdowns. Cooling systems would prevent overheating. The technology would be so safe that people would forget they were driving nuclear reactors, would think of them simply as cars, normal vehicles that happened to run on atoms rather than gasoline. Costs would be higher initially. Nuclear cars expensive compared to conventional vehicles, but economies of scale would bring prices down. Eventually, nuclear cars would cost the same as gasoline cars, or less, the savings in fuel over the vehicle's lifetime offsetting higher purchase price, and the convenience, the freedom from refueling would be worth any premium. Some designs imagined even smaller reactors. Nuclear scooters, nuclear bicycles, nuclear lawn mowers. Every device that needed power could run on its own reactor, completely self-sufficient, completely independent from electrical grids and fuel distribution networks. Energy would be personal, portable, perpetual. The nuclear car represented modernity incarnate. Atomic age made tangible. Progress you could drive. It was science fiction made real. Impossible technology becoming everyday convenience. The future arriving on highways and suburban streets, humming quietly past houses where people waved from lawns, never knowing they were watching nuclear reactors commute to work. No one adequately considered the dangers. Thousands of nuclear reactors driving on highways, through neighborhoods, past schools. Accidents that would scatter radioactive material across crash sites. Maintenance that would require handling nuclear waste. Disposal when cars reached end of life. Thousands of spent reactor cores needing safe storage for millennia. No one imagined that nuclear reactors, however miniaturized, would remain too expensive, too complex, too dangerous for consumer vehicles. That liability concerns would prevent manufacturers from selling nuclear cars, that regulations would prohibit them, that public fear would make them unmarketable even if technically feasible. No one considered that gasoline, despite its flaws, worked well enough, was cheap enough, was familiar enough. That the infrastructure existed, the supply chains operated, the economics made sense. That replacing all of it with nuclear power would require transformation society was unwilling to undertake. But the 1950s believed in atomic everything, believed nuclear power was the answer to every energy question, would replace every combustion process, would power every device. They looked at cars gulping gasoline and imagined cars running on atoms, clean and efficient and eternal. It was a magnificent dream. Cars that never needed fuel, highways without gas stations, commutes without pollution. The atomic age bringing freedom from fossil fuels, from dependence on oil, from the endless cycle of filling tanks and paying for fuel, and driving their gasoline cars to gas stations, pumping fuel that would be gone in a week. They imagined a future where that ritual disappeared, where cars ran forever on the power of split atoms, where energy was so abundant it was essentially free. It never happened. Nuclear cars remained concepts, drawings, dreams, but for a moment they seemed inevitable, seemed obvious, seemed like the only logical future for transportation in the atomic age. Beyond the household robots that cleaned and cooked, the 1950s imagined something more. Personal robots, companions, machines with personality, with intelligence, with the ability to converse, to assist, to keep you company. By the year 2000, everyone would have one. A friendly robot who knew your schedule, your preferences, your moods. The vision was specific, not hulking metal servants but approachable machines, designed with friendly faces, pleasant voices, bodies shaped vaguely like humans so they felt familiar, rather than alien. They would walk beside you, talk with you, learn from you, become genuinely helpful presences in your life, rather than tools you used and forgot. Children would grow up with robot companions, machines that played games, helped with homework, told stories at bedtime. The robot would never tire of questions, never lose patience with repetition, never grow bored with the 100th game of hide and seek. It would be friend, tutor and guardian combined, watching over children with senses that never blinked, with attention that never wandered. Adults would appreciate different capabilities. A companion that remembered every appointment, every birthday, every task you mentioned needing to do. That offered reminders gently, suggestions tactfully, assistance without judgment. You could think aloud to your robot, processing problems verbally, and it would listen, respond, help you work through challenges without the social complexity of human conversation. Elderly people, particularly, would benefit. Robots that provided company without demanding reciprocation, that assisted with daily tasks without making residents feel helpless, that monitored health subtly and called for help when needed. Loneliness would diminish. Independence would extend. The isolation that plagued aging would be eased by mechanical companions that never left, never got tired, never had somewhere else to be. The robots would have personalities, not identical, but customizable. Some people would want cheerful companions, eternally optimistic, always encouraging. Others would prefer dry wit, sarcasm, humour that matched their own sensibility. The robot would adapt, learning from interactions, developing personality that complemented rather than clashed with its owner. Conversations would feel natural. The robot would follow context, remember previous discussions, refer back to things you mentioned weeks earlier. It would know your preferences without being told repeatedly, would anticipate needs based on patterns, would feel less like a machine and more like someone who genuinely knew you, genuinely cared about helping. Some designs imagined emotional intelligence, robots that recognized moods, that responded appropriately to happiness, to sadness, to frustration. That offered comfort when you were upset, celebrated achievements with you, provided the emotional support that humans sometimes lacked availability or willingness to give. Not replacement for human relationships, the 1950s insisted, but supplement, additional support that made life easier. Mobility would be sophisticated. The robot would follow you from room to room, stay nearby when needed, retreat when you wanted privacy. It would navigate obstacles, climb stairs, operate in any environment a human could access. You would never need to think about where your robot was or how to summon it. It would simply be present, available, ready. Security would improve. The robot would notice unusual sounds, unfamiliar people, potential dangers. It would protect you, alert authorities, provide assistance in emergencies. You would sleep easier knowing your companion was monitoring your home, watching for threats, keeping you safe with sensors more acute than human senses. Work would become easier. The robot would assist with tasks, fetch tools, hold things, provide extra hands exactly when needed. It would learn your work habits, anticipate requirements, make itself useful without requiring direction. Collaboration between human and robot would be seamless, natural, productive. No one worried about dependence, about whether relying on robots for company, for memory, for assistance, would atrophy human capabilities, whether people would forget how to remember things, to do things, to connect with other humans, outsourcing so much to machines that essential human skills deteriorated. No one considered whether robot companionship would satisfy, whether mechanical personality, however sophisticated, would feel hollow compared to genuine human connection, whether conversations with something that could not truly understand, could not truly care, would leave people lonelier than before, surrounded by simulacra of relationship rather than substance. No one imagined that creating truly intelligent, truly companionable robots would prove far harder than expected. That personality, understanding, emotional intelligence, all the qualities that made someone good company, would resist programming, would remain uniquely human for decades beyond predicted timelines. But the 1950s believed in friendly robots, in mechanical companions that would ease loneliness, assist with life, make existence more comfortable and less solitary. They imagined coming home to someone, even if that someone was silicon and circuits, even if that someone existed only to serve. It was the dream of companionship without complication, of help without obligation, of relationship that demanded nothing, gave everything, existed solely to make your life better. And in an era increasingly aware of isolation, of alienation, of loneliness even in crowds, that dream felt necessary, valuable, worth building toward. Sweating in summer, shivering in winter, layering clothes, adjusting thermostats, never quite comfortable. The 1950s hated this inefficiency, so they imagined clothing that regulated itself, fabrics embedded with tiny heating and cooling elements, shirts that warmed you in winter, jackets that cooled you in summer, comfort, always, regardless of weather. The technology seemed achievable. Electric blankets existed, proving that fabric could generate heat. Refrigeration worked, proving that cooling was possible. Combine them, miniaturize them, build them into clothing, and you had climate control worn rather than installed, personal rather than environmental, following you instead of filling rooms. Imagine winter mornings transformed, no more layering, sweaters, no more heavy coats, no more shivering walks to the car, just a climate-controlled shirt, thin and light, that kept you perfectly warm regardless of temperature outside. Set it to your preferred warmth, forget about weather, go about your day comfortable, Summer would be equally improved. No more sweat-soaked shirts, no more desperate seeking of air conditioning, no more heat exhaustion. Climate-controlled fabric would keep you cool, would wick away moisture, would maintain comfortable temperature even in blazing heat. Outdoor work would become tolerable. Exercise would be less miserable. Life would continue comfortably through seasons that previously demanded suffering. The clothing would be subtle. No bulky batteries, no visible wiring, just fabric that felt normal, looked normal, functioned extraordinarily. The heating and cooling elements would be woven directly into material, invisible, weightless, powered by batteries small enough to hide in seams or collars. Controls would be simple. A small dial, maybe a button, letting you adjust temperature with a twist or a press. Some designs imagined automatic regulation, sensors measuring skin temperature, adjusting heating or cooling to maintain perfect comfort without conscious thought. The clothing would think for you, would manage climate invisibly, would let you forget entirely about temperature. Fashion would not suffer. Climate-controlled fabrics would come in every style, every colour, every design. Formal wear, casual wear, athletic wear, all enhanced with temperature regulation. You would choose clothes based on appearance, not warmth, knowing comfort was built in, regardless of how the outfit looked. Athletic performance would improve. Athletes would train in climate-controlled gear that prevented overheating, that maintained optimal body temperature, that let them push harder without thermal limitations. Records would fall, performances would improve, purely because temperature stopped being obstacle. Military applications seemed obvious. Soldiers operating in deserts, in Arctic conditions, in any extreme environment, would wear climate-controlled uniforms that maintained survivable temperatures regardless of external conditions. Heat casualties would drop. Cold injuries would decrease. Troops would remain effective in environments previously barely survivable. Medical uses would emerge. Climate-controlled clothing for patients with conditions affecting temperature regulation, with fevers, with circulation problems. The fabric would help maintain healthy temperature, would prevent dangerous overheating or cooling, would assist bodies struggling with basic thermal management. Power sources would improve over time. Initial versions might require daily charging, batteries lasting only hours. But eventually solar fabrics would charge from ambient light. Kinetic generators would charge from movement. Fuel cells would provide days of power. The clothing would become self-sustaining, never needing connection to outlets, powered by the environment and the wearer's own activity. Cost would start high, but drop rapidly. Early adopters would pay premiums, but mass production would bring prices down. Eventually, climate-controlled clothing would cost barely more than regular clothing. The technology so standardized, so efficient, that it became default rather than luxury. No one worried about complexity, about fabrics that could fail, that could overheat or overcool, that could malfunction in ways regular fabric never did. About maintenance, repairs, the possibility that clothing would need troubleshooting, that wardrobes would require technical support. No one considered that people might want simplicity, that clothing that just existed, that required no power, no settings, no thinking, had value precisely because it made no demands. That the satisfaction of dressing might be diminished if every outfit required charging, checking, adjusting. No one imagined that climate control through environment, through buildings and vehicles, would prove more practical than climate control through clothing. That heating rooms would remain easier than heating people. That the existing approach would persist because it worked well enough. But the 1950s believed in personal climate control, in technology serving individual comfort, in clothing that adapted to wearer rather than wearer adapting to weather. They shivered through winters, sweltered through summers, and imagined fabric that would make seasons irrelevant, that would maintain comfort regardless of calendar, that would let them be perfectly temperate always. It was the dream of thermal independence, of never being too hot or too cold again, of comfort as constant rather than occasional, as guaranteed rather than hoped for. And suffering through another uncomfortable season, they believed it was coming, believed the future would wear its climate control, believed that clothing would finally, mercifully think for itself. Why stay in one place? In the year 2000, homes would be mobile, built on platforms, equipped with wheels or hover technology, ready to relocate at will. Do not like your neighbours? Move. Tired of the view? Relocate. The future would offer freedom, flexibility, houses that travelled. The concept merged two ideas: the permanence of houses with the mobility of vehicles. Your home would be substantial, solid, fully equipped with everything a stationary house contained: plumbing, electricity, furniture, appliances. But underneath, hidden beneath floor and foundation, would be mechanisms for movement, systems that could lift the entire structure and transport it elsewhere. Imagine the possibilities. Job relocation would be simple. No more selling your house, searching for new housing, packing and moving possessions. Just relocate your house, drive it to the new city, find a suitable lot, settle it into place. Your home, your possessions, your familiar space, all transported intact to new location. Seasonal migration would become routine. Spend summers in cool northern climates, winters in warm southern ones. Follow perfect weather year-round, moving with the seasons like migratory birds, never enduring heat or cold, always comfortable. Your house would travel highways, would park in designated zones, would adapt to wherever you wanted to be. Retirement would transform. No more moving to retirement communities, leaving behind homes filled with memories. Instead, take those homes with you. Relocate to Florida, to Arizona, to wherever suited your retirement, bringing your house along, your space, your comfort, your history, all mobile. Social flexibility would increase. Disagreements with neighbours would no longer require endurance or expensive relocation. Just move your house. Find new neighbours, new street, new community. The ability to leave would reduce conflict, would make bad situations temporary, rather than trapped. Natural disasters would become less catastrophic. Hurricane approaching. Move your house inland. Wildfire threatening. Relocate to safety. Flood predicted. Drive to higher ground. Homes would be salvageable, preservable, removable from danger rather than abandoned destruction. The technology seemed feasible. Mobile homes already existed, proving the concept viable on small scale. Make them larger, more sophisticated, more comfortable, and you had mobile houses indistinguishable from stationary ones except for their ability to move. Wheels or hover technology would handle transport. Automated systems would manage relocation, requiring no more effort from owners than programming destinations. Infrastructure would adapt. Lots would be standardized, equipped with universal hookups for utilities. Water, electricity, sewage, all available through standardized connections that any mobile house could plug into. Move to new lot, connect utilities, settle in. The house would be ready to occupy within hours. Communities would form differently. Neighborhoods would be fluid, residents changing frequently, some staying long-term, others visiting briefly. Towns would compete to attract mobile houses, offering amenities, views, climates. Geography would lose meaning. You would choose location based on preference, not permanence, knowing you could change your mind, could leave, could explore. Children would grow up accustomed to mobility. Home would mean the structure itself, not the location. Friendships would form and dissolve naturally as families moved. Adaptability would be trained from youth, flexibility valued, attachment to place diminished in favour of attachment to people, to experiences, to the mobile home itself. Some designs imagine luxury features, mobile houses with retractable wheels, disguising their mobility when stationary. Houses that could join together, multiple units combining into larger structures for gatherings, then separating. Houses that change configurations, rooms rearranging, floor plans adapting to needs. No one adequately considered the social consequences, whether communities could form when residents were literally transient, when commitment to place was optional, when leaving was easier than staying, whether neighbourhoods would feel like neighbourhoods if anyone could depart at any moment. No one worried about infrastructure strain, about roads designed for cars trying to accommodate houses, about utility systems struggling to serve constantly changing populations, about planning and zoning in worlds where houses moved freely, where residential areas were fluid rather than fixed. No one imagined that people would want permanence, that attachment to place, to community, to specific locations mattered deeply, that roots, however, metaphorically provided stability, belonging, identity that mobility could not replace. But the 1950s valued freedom, valued movement, valued escape from constraints. They looked at fixed houses and saw limitation, imagined mobile ones and saw liberation, believed the future would offer choice, flexibility, the ability to take your home anywhere, to never be trapped by geography or circumstance. It was the dream of ultimate freedom, of home and mobility combined, of never having to choose between comfort and adventure, between stability and exploration. And living in houses that could not move, locked to lots by foundation and investment, they imagined a future where houses travelled, where home was wherever you parked it, where the whole world was available without ever leaving your living room. Landlocked states suffered. Their residents longed for oceans, for beaches, for the soothing rhythm of waves. The 1950 solution? Build them. Create synthetic oceans, enormous inland bodies of water, complete with artificial beaches, controlled tides, perfect weather. By the year 2000, everyone could live by the sea, real or otherwise. The concept was ambitious but logical. Humanity had already created lakes, dammed rivers, redirected water on massive scales. Why not create oceans? Not naturally occurring ones, obviously, but engineered water bodies so large, so deep, so convincingly ocean-like that the distinction barely mattered. Dig enormous basins in landlocked regions, fill them with water, add salt, generate waves mechanically, and suddenly Kansas had coastline. Beaches would be constructed from imported or manufactured sand, shaped and graded to perfect slopes, maintained to ideal conditions. Palm trees would be planted even in climates where they could not naturally survive, protected by climate control, by domes if necessary. The beach experience would be manufactured but real, artificial but functional, fake but enjoyable. Waves would be generated mechanically, massive underwater systems creating swells that rolled to shore with regularity real oceans could not match. Surf would be customizable, adjusted to preferences, scaled for beginners or experts. Surfing would become available everywhere, democratic, accessible to landlocked millions who previously could only dream of riding waves. Tides would operate on schedules, controlled rather than lunar. High tide at convenient times, low tide when beach area should expand. The randomness and inconvenience of natural tides would be eliminated, replaced by patterns optimized for human use, for recreation, for predictability. Water would be maintained at perfect temperature year-round. No more cold oceans, no more seasonal variation. Climate control, heating in winter, cooling in summer, would keep synthetic oceans comfortable always. Swimming would be pleasant regardless of season, regardless of latitude. Marine life could be introduced selectively. Desirable fish, colourful species, interesting creatures, all stocked carefully, monitored, managed. Dangerous animals would be excluded. Jellyfish would not be invited. Sharks would be unwelcome. The ocean would contain beauty without threat, diversity without danger. Resort towns would develop around synthetic oceans, entire economies built on artificial coastlines. Hotels, restaurants, surf shops, all catering to populations finally able to access beach experiences previously available only to coastal residents. Tourism would redistribute, wealth would spread, landlocked regions would gain economic opportunities previously monopolized by coasts. Children in Nebraska, in Kansas, in Oklahoma would grow up knowing oceans, swimming in them, building sandcastles on their shores. The cultural divide between coastal and inland would diminish. Ocean references in media, in conversation, would become universal rather than regional. Everyone would understand tides, waves, salt water, beach culture. Real estate values would equalize. Oceanfront property would no longer command premiums because ocean frontage would be abundant, available, buildable anywhere, with sufficient space and engineering. The wealthy would lose their monopoly on beach access. Beaches would democratize. Some designs imagined covered synthetic oceans, enormous domes or retractable roofs protecting water from weather, maintaining perfect conditions regardless of external climate. Others proposed floating islands, artificial atolls, structures on synthetic ocean surfaces providing additional land, additional development opportunities. Engineering challenges were acknowledged but considered solvable. Water supply, water treatment, wave generation, climate control, all were simply matters of scale, of applying existing technologies more ambitiously. The inland ocean was not impossible, just expensive, just ambitious, just waiting for investment and will. No one adequately considered environmental impact. The massive water consumption, the energy required for climate control, the disruption of creating enormous basins, the ongoing maintenance needs. Whether synthetic, oceans were sustainable, whether they made ecological sense, whether they were worth their cost. No one worried about authenticity, whether manufactured oceans would satisfy, whether the knowledge that waves were mechanical and tides were scheduled would diminish the experience. Whether part of the ocean's appeal was its naturalness, its wildness, its existence independent of human control. No one imagined that people would prefer real oceans, however distant, to synthetic ones, however convenient. That the journey to the coast, the rarity of beach visits, the authentic experience of natural ocean had value precisely because it was not engineered, not controlled, not optimized. But the 1950s believed in building their way to better, in engineering solutions to geographical limitations, in making the impossible routine through application of technology and will. They looked at inland maps and saw empty spaces begging for oceans, looked at landlocked populations and saw potential customers for artificial beaches. And sitting in states far from coasts, dreaming of waves and sand and salt air, they believed synthetic oceans were coming, believed technology would bring the beach to them, believed the year 2000 would offer ocean access to everyone. Geography be damned. It was the dream of conquering limitation through construction, of denying geography, of building desire directly, of making the world conform to want rather than accepting what nature provided. And in that optimistic decade it seemed not just possible but inevitable. This was the biggest dream, the one that mattered most. By the year 2000, the 1950s believed, humanity would have outgrown war. Technology would provide abundance, science would solve disputes, reason would triumph, the future would be peaceful, united, free from the violence that scarred the past. It was the hope that carried them forward, the belief that tomorrow would be better, kinder, wiser than today. War had defined the 1950s generation. They lived through World War II, watched the Korean conflict, felt the constant tension of Cold War. They knew war intimately, understood its horror, its cost, its waste, and they desperately wanted to believe their children would not have to know it, that the future would finally learn what the past never could. The logic seemed sound. Wars happened over resources, over scarcity, over competition for limited goods. But technology was eliminating scarcity. Food production was increasing. Energy would be infinite, courtesy of atomic power. Manufacturing was becoming automated, capable of producing abundance for everyone. When everyone had enough, what would anyone fight over? Communication was improving. Misunderstanding caused conflict. But video phones, telepathy eventually, would make understanding perfect. Cultural exchange was increasing. People were travelling, learning about each other, realising humanity's fundamental similarity. Prejudice would fade. Fear would diminish. Connection would replace division. Education was spreading. Ignorance fueled war, kept populations willing to fight, kept them believing propaganda, accepting violence. But universal education was coming. Literacy was rising. Knowledge was democratizing. Educated populations, the thinking went, would be peaceful populations, too informed to be manipulated into war. International cooperation was strengthening. The United Nations existed, imperfect but functional, providing forum for dispute resolution, mechanism for addressing grievances without violence. By 2000, such institutions would be mature, powerful, effective. Conflicts would be settled through discussion, negotiation, arbitration, all the civilized alternatives to bloodshed. Nuclear weapons made war obsolete. This was the darkest reasoning, but perhaps the most convincing. War between nuclear powers meant mutual destruction. No victory was possible, only annihilation. Surely humanity would recognize this, would understand that war had become suicide, would choose survival, would find other ways to resolve differences. Some predictions imagined world government, nation-states dissolving, borders becoming administrative rather than defensive, humanity organizing globally rather than locally, one government, one law, one human family. Internal conflicts were possible, certainly, but war in the traditional sense, armies crossing borders, nations destroying nations, would become historical, impossible under unified global governance. Technology would provide verification, satellites would monitor the planet, would make secret military build-up impossible. Weapons treaties could be enforced because violations would be visible from space. Trust would not be required when surveillance made deception impossible. Children would grow up in this peaceful world, hearing about war the way previous generations heard about slavery, about gladiatorial combat, about barbaric practices abandoned as civilization advanced. History books would cover wars, certainly, but as closed chapters, finished eras, things that happened before humanity matured. Resources would be redirected. Military budgets, enormous in the 1950s, would be reallocated to productive uses. Research funding would flow to medicine, to science, to exploration, to endeavours that built rather than destroyed. The talent currently devoted to weapons development would design spacecraft, cure diseases, solve problems that mattered. Veterans would be the last generation. Men who fought in World War II in Korea would be historical anomalies, the final people who knew combat firsthand. Their grandchildren would find their stories unbelievable, would struggle to imagine a world where nations sent citizens to kill each other over territory, ideology, resources. The dream was not just negative, not just absence of war. It was positive vision of what humanity could accomplish without war, of cooperation, collaboration, shared effort toward common goals, of problems solved through science rather than violence, of disputes resolved through reason rather than force, of humanity finally, mercifully growing up. Some believers went further. Imagine not just no war, but active global friendship. International projects, joint missions to space, collaborative research initiatives. Humanity working together, pooling talent and resources, achieving things no single nation could accomplish. Peace not as stalemate, but as partnership. No one imagined that war would persist, that new conflicts would arise, that ideological differences would prove intractable, that human nature would resist the optimistic predictions, that nuclear weapons would create standoff but not peace, that small wars would continue despite large ones being prevented, that violence would adapt rather than disappear. No one predicted that the year 2000 would arrive with wars still raging, with conflicts younger than the predictions themselves, with violence proven resilient to education, to communication, to abundance, to all the forces supposed to eliminate it. But the 1950s needed to believe, needed to think their suffering had purchased something, that the wars they fought would be the last, that their children's future would be better, safer, kinder. They could not bear imagining otherwise, and so they dreamed the biggest dream, the most important dream, the dream that made all other dreams meaningful. They dreamed of peace, not temporary peace, not uneasy peace, but permanent, stable, genuine peace. A world where armies disbanded, where weapons were museum pieces, where international relations meant friendship rather than careful management of hostility. It was naive, it was beautiful. And sitting in living rooms still healing from recent war, still anxious about potential war, still exhausted by the constant threat of war, they believed it, completely. The future would be peaceful. It had to be. Humanity would learn, would change, would finally, after millennia of violence, choose better. And that belief, however unfulfilled, however disappointed by reality, mattered. Because dreaming peace, imagining peace, believing in peace, was itself an act of hope. Was itself resistance to despair. Was itself the seed of something better, even if the harvest never came. The 1950s looked toward 2000 and saw humanity reconciled, united, freed from its oldest curse. They saw the dream other dreams pointed toward, the reason all the technology, all the progress, all the advancement mattered. They saw the world they were building for, and it was beautiful. The ocean covered most of the planet, yet humans could only visit its surface, could only glimpse its depths briefly, before lungs demanded return to air. By the year 2000, the 1950s believed that limitation would end, technology would allow underwater breathing, extended submersion, perhaps permanent aquatic living. The ocean would become habitat, not just destination. The concept started with practical need. Divers wanted longer bottom time, deeper access, freedom from cumbersome equipment. But the vision expanded quickly into something more ambitious. Humans adapted for ocean life, breathing underwater as naturally as breathing air, living beneath the waves in permanent settlements, becoming amphibious through technology. Several approaches seemed promising. Artificial gills were the most elegant solution. Devices that extracted oxygen directly from water the way fish did, eliminating need for air tanks entirely. You would strap on a gill unit, submerge, breathe normally. Water would flow through the device, oxygen would be extracted, carbon dioxide expelled. Diving would become unlimited, bounded only by cold, by pressure, by human endurance rather than air supply. Research was already underway. Scientists understood the chemistry, knew that water contained dissolved oxygen, knew that extraction was theoretically possible. The engineering was challenging but not impossible. Membranes that could filter oxygen efficiently, pumps that could move sufficient water volume, systems compact enough to wear. By the 70s or 80s, they predicted working artificial gills would exist. By 2000, they would be commonplace. Liquid breathing offered an alternative approach. Experiments showed that lungs could process oxygen-rich fluids, that mammals could breathe liquid under certain conditions. Fill your lungs with specially formulated fluid saturated with oxygen, and you could breathe underwater without gills, without equipment, with nothing but the fluid itself providing oxygen. Submersion would become internal rather than external, your own lungs handling the interface between body and ocean. The experience would be strange initially, fighting every instinct to surface, to expel water from lungs to breathe air. But training would overcome reflex. Liquid breathing would become natural, comfortable, preferred for extended dives. You would exhale air, inhale fluid, sink beneath the waves, breathing ocean itself. Permanent underwater habitats would follow. Cities built on the seafloor, enclosed in transparent domes or constructed from pressure-resistant materials, housing populations that lived primarily submerged. Residents would work underwater, play underwater, sleep in chambers surrounded by ocean, waking to views of coral reefs and passing fish rather than streets and sky. Children would be trained from infancy, learning to swim before walking, becoming comfortable underwater before they were comfortable on land. They would be the first truly amphibious generation, equally at home in ocean and air, moving between environments as easily as walking between rooms. Pressure adaptation would be solved medically. Drugs or treatments that allowed rapid pressure changes without decompression sickness, that strengthened tissues against crushing depths, that enabled humans to dive deep without the lengthy decompression stops that made deep diving dangerous and time-consuming. The ocean's depth would become accessible, explorable, survivable. Aquatic agriculture would develop. Underwater farms growing kelp, harvesting fish, cultivating coral, ocean ranching where whales and dolphins were tended like cattle, their products harvested sustainably. The ocean would feed humanity, would provide protein, minerals, resources currently neglected because harvesting them was difficult. Mining would expand underwater. Minerals on the ocean floor, metals concentrated by geological processes, ores waiting for extraction. Underwater cities would be mining towns, populations supporting themselves through ocean resources, through industries impossible on land. Tourism would transform. Underwater hotels, restaurants with ocean views from inside rather than outside, theatres where audiences watched performances while sharks and rays circled overhead. The ocean would become destination, attraction, experience accessible to ordinary people rather than only trained divers. Communication with marine life might become possible. Research into dolphin intelligence, whale songs, fish behaviour all suggested sophisticated consciousness. By 2000, translation devices might enable conversation, might allow humans and ocean creatures to communicate, to understand each other, to share the ocean as cooperative inhabitants rather than separate species. No one adequately considered isolation, what it would feel like living permanently underwater, cut off from sky, from weather, from the terrestrial world humans evolved for. Where the pressure both literal and psychological would crush spirits, whether ocean living would feel like freedom or imprisonment. No one worried about the ocean's fragility, whether human occupation would damage ecosystems, whether our presence would disrupt balances that had existed for millions of years, whether the ocean could support human population without being fundamentally altered, degraded, destroyed. No one imagined that ocean living would remain niche, specialized, limited to researchers and enthusiasts rather than becoming mainstream. That most humans would prefer land, air, familiar environments despite ocean's allure. But the 1950s looked at the ocean's vastness and saw opportunity, saw space for expansion, resources for harvesting, frontiers for pioneering. They imagined their grandchildren breathing underwater, living in ocean cities, spending lives beneath the waves in the 70% of Earth's surface that had always been off limits. It was the dream of conquering the last earthly frontier, of making the ocean ours, not through boats that floated above, but through adaptation that let us enter, inhabit, belong. And standing on beaches looking at waves, they believed it was coming, believed technology would give them gills, give them access, give them the ocean as second home. Language divided humanity. Brilliant minds could not collaborate because they spoke different tongues. Cultures remained isolated because communication was impossible without years of language study. But by the year 2000, the 1950 predicted, translation would be instant. Devices would interpret speech in real time, breaking down language barriers, making every human conversation possible regardless of native tongue. The concept was straightforward. A small device, perhaps pocket-sized, perhaps Warner's earpiece, would listen to foreign speech, process it instantly, and output translation in your language. Simultaneously, it would translate your words into the other person's language. Conversations would flow naturally, each person speaking their native tongue, each understanding the other perfectly. Technology was already pointing toward this possibility. Computers were beginning to handle language, to process words, to follow linguistic rules. They were clumsy, certainly, slow and error-prone, but they proved the concept viable. Language was code, and code could be translated. By 2000, processing power would increase sufficiently. Algorithms would improve enough that instant translation would become trivial, automatic, perfect. International cooperation would accelerate dramatically. Diplomats speaking directly without interpreters, scientists collaborating without language barriers, business conducted between any parties, regardless of their native languages. The delays, the misunderstandings, the mistranslations that plagued international relations would disappear. Humanity would finally be able to communicate as one species rather than as dozens of mutually unintelligible groups. Travel would transform. Tourists could visit any country, speak with locals directly, ask directions, order meals, have genuine conversations, without learning languages beforehand. The world would open, accessibility expanding beyond English-speaking destinations, beyond tourist areas where English was common. Every place would become approachable, every culture accessible. Education would change. Children would still learn languages, but the pressure would ease. Translation devices would provide backup, would allow communication even with imperfect language skills, would make mistakes less catastrophic. Language learning would become about culture and nuance rather than basic communication necessity. Business would globalize further. Small companies could sell internationally without hiring translators, could communicate with overseas partners directly, could expand into markets previously blocked by language barriers. Economic opportunities would multiply, competition would increase, the global economy would integrate more thoroughly, immigration would be easier, newcomers to countries could communicate immediately, could navigate bureaucracy, find employment, build social connections without waiting months or years to learn the local language. Integration would accelerate, cultural exchange would deepen, nations would become more truly multicultural. Some designs imagined visual translation too. Devices that could read foreign text and display translation in real time, augmented reality overlaying translations on signs, menus, documents. You would look at Japanese characters and see English words, would read Russian newspapers as easily as local ones, would navigate foreign cities with complete comprehension. Cultural understanding would improve. Language shapes thought, encodes cultural assumptions, carries nuance that literal translation misses. Advanced translation devices would preserve this, would convey not just words but meaning, context, cultural subtext. Understanding would be genuine rather than superficial. Arguments between peoples would decrease. Misunderstanding fueled conflict. Clear communication prevented escalation. When everyone could speak with everyone else, when intentions were perfectly clear, when cultural confusion was eliminated, many sources of international tension would simply evaporate. Literature would become universal. Books could be read in any language immediately, authors reaching global audiences without waiting for translation, without losing nuance to translators' choices. Every story would belong to everyone. Every poet would speak to the whole world. The devices would be affordable, ubiquitous, standard equipment like watches or wallets. Everyone would carry one. Children would grow up never knowing the frustration of being unable to communicate, never experiencing the isolation of not understanding or being understood. No one worried that something would be lost, that the effort of learning languages taught patience, cultural humility, mental flexibility, that struggling with foreign languages built empathy, appreciation for difficulty others faced. That easy translation might reduce motivation to truly learn about other cultures. No one considered that language was not just communication but identity, heritage, connection to history and ancestors. That instant translation might homogenize, might make languages feel less vital, might accelerate the death of minority languages as convenience reduced incentive to maintain them. No one imagined that translation would remain imperfect for decades. That context, idiom, cultural reference, wordplay, all the richness that made language more than vocabulary, would resist automation, would keep human translators employed, would prevent the instant perfect translation they imagined. But the 1950s believed in breaking down barriers, in connecting humanity, in using technology to overcome divisions. They looked at language differences and saw solvable problems, saw obstacles that engineering could eliminate, saw the year 2000 as a time when any person could speak with any other person, when language would finally stop dividing what technology could unite. It was the dream of Babel reversed, of humanity communicating freely, perfectly, without the curse of mutual incomprehension, and struggling to communicate with immigrants, with tourists, with business partners whose languages they did not speak. They believed the devices were coming, believed translation would become instant, believed the future would speak in every tongue and understand them all. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your blankets, as the day finally releases its grip and sleep begins to arrive like an old friend, take a moment to think about the people of 1955, the ones who sat in living rooms just like yours, wondering what the future would bring, the ones who flipped through magazines filled with flying cars and robot butlers, who genuinely believed that the year 2000 would solve every problem, answer every question, deliver every dream. They were so hopeful, so certain that tomorrow would be miraculous. They imagined cities in the sky and pills that replaced meals and machines that could read their thoughts. They believed technology would conquer disease, end war, make life effortless and perfect. And they were wrong about nearly all of it. The future arrived, and it looked nothing like their glossy predictions. But here is what matters. They dreamed anyway. They hoped anyway. They looked at a world still healing from war, still figuring out how to live with atomic power, still divided and uncertain, and they chose optimism. They chose to believe in better. And that belief, however misplaced in its specifics, mattered. It carried them forward. It gave them reason to build, to try, to invest in a future they would never see. We can learn from that. Not from their predictions, which were beautifully, wildly wrong, but from their willingness to imagine, to hope, to believe that tomorrow could be kinder than today. So maybe, tonight before sleep takes you, imagine your own future. Not with flying cars or robot companions, but with something small and true. A moment of connection, a problem solved, a kindness given. The 1950s taught us that the future rarely looks like we expect, but that does not mean it is not worth dreaming about. History is not just what happened. It is also what people hoped would happen. And those hopes, even the ones that never came true, still matter. They still mean something. They still carry forward. Rest easy now. The future is still out there, waiting. And like the people of 1955, we get to imagine it. We get to hope for it. We get to believe, even just a little, that tomorrow might be beautiful. Good night.